dive into her guide for breaking the rules. First things first, to really get Woolf, you have to understand the literary battlefield she was stepping onto. On one side, you had the old guard, the establishment, writers she cheekily called the materialists. Think H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett. These guys were masters of the outside world, describing every last detail. But on the other side, a new wave was rising. Woolf put herself and authors like James Joyce in this camp, calling them the spiritualists. Why? Because they were exploring a totally different frontier, the inner world of the human mind. And this gets us right to the heart of her big complaint. Woolf looked around at the most popular novels of her day, and she thought, these are perfectly constructed, they're detailed, they seem realistic, but they're missing the most important thing of all. They're missing life itself. She saw the traditional rules of writing, the neat plot, the mandatory love story, the tidy ending, not as helpful tools, but as a kind of tyrant. This tyrant, she said, was holding writers captive, forcing them into these predictable formulas that have almost nothing to do with how we actually experience our own reality. It was like they were slaves to convention. She had this brilliant metaphor to explain it. She said, these other writers were building these magnificent, flawless houses in their novels. I mean, every brick was perfect, every detail was just so. But here's the problem. All the windows were sealed shut. No fresh air, no chaos, none of the messiness of actual life could ever get inside. They were beautiful, sure, but they were also completely sterile. Okay, so if the old way was broken, what was her big solution? This is where we get her first tool. She laid out a totally new mission for novelists. Stop just describing the outside of the house and start capturing the messy, chaotic, beautiful flow of what it feels like to be alive inside it. She said, look, life isn't this neat, orderly straight line. It's not like a row of street lamps, all perfectly arranged. No, she saw it as the shimmering, always changing, luminous halo of thoughts and feelings and memories that surrounds us from one moment to the next. And that, she believed, was the writer's real job, to somehow capture that halo on the page. So, how on earth do you write a halo? Well, she championed a technique that was perfect for it: stream of consciousness. The whole idea was to try and record thoughts as they actually happen, all those random little atoms as they fall upon the mind. It's about tracing the true path of our inner world, no matter how jumpy or disconnected it might seem from the outside. But here's the thing, Woolf was also deeply practical. She knew that this kind of daring, artistic freedom doesn't just happen in a vacuum. To get the mental space to actually explore that luminous halo, she argued that a writer, and she was very specific here, especially a woman writer, needed two very concrete things that history had usually denied them: financial independence and a private, physical space to think, money, and a room of one's own. Okay, so let's shift gears to her second tool, because she wasn't just trying to free writers, she wanted to free us, the readers, too. She saw that we'd all become a little bit enslaved to the so-called experts and the critics who were always telling us what we should think about a book. Her advice for us is so simple, it's almost radical. Ignore all that noise. Forget the book reviews, forget what the academics say. She begged readers to trust their own gut, to follow their own instincts, arguing that your personal reaction to a book is the only one that truly matters in the end. And she even gave us a clear 3-step plan for how to do this as a common reader. Step 1, collaborate. Don't start judging right away. Open your mind and just try to become part of the author's world. Step 2, understand. Get a real feel for the time and place the book came from. And only after you've done those two things do you get to step 3, judge. Form your own opinion and own it. Now, this third and final tool, this one might be her most revolutionary. It's not just about writing differently or reading differently. It's about this incredible act of historical recovery. It's about going back and finding the genius that history has buried and completely forgotten. Woolf argued that for centuries, history was essentially split in two. You had the public world, the world of men. That's where you find the epic poems, the politics, the wars. That's the stuff that got written down and celebrated. And then you had the private world, the world of women, a world of letters, diaries, quiet observations, a world that was almost always dismissed as trivial. But Woolf said, hold on. It was in that private world that a whole new kind of genius was being born. She points to people like Dorothy Osborne from the 17th century. Osborne's brilliance was trapped in her personal letters, but Woolf read them and saw all the ingredients of a great novel: razor-sharp characters, an amazing ear for dialogue, real psychological depth. Or someone like Mary Wollstonecraft, whose life was so defiant and radical that her life itself was the work of art, a story written in actions, not just in ink. So here's the bombshell, the crucial point she was making. The modern novel, with its deep dive into our inner lives, wasn't invented on some grand public stage. Woolf believed it was being secretly invented, piece by piece, for generations, in the private diaries and letters of women who had no other place to put their creative fire. And all of this brings us to her ultimate legacy. It's not some dusty old theory you read in a textbook. No, it's a living, breathing challenge that she leaves for every single one of us today. What she really gave us is a roadmap, a guide to help us look past the official, celebrated, prize-winning art and learn to find genius in all the unexpected places. She taught us to value the scraps and fragments, the diaries and letters of her time, and maybe the blogs, the social media threads, the podcasts of ours, the places where news stories are being told right now. And so her work doesn't really end with an answer. It ends with a question that she hands directly to us. Who are the overlooked geniuses of our time? Whose incredible stories are unfolding right in front of us, but maybe in a form we haven't learned how to recognize as art yet? Whose voices are...
दोनों की शादी में सेम फोटोग्राफर था, सेम एल्बम बनाई, पर आज उसकी एल्बम में गोवा की फोटोज हैं और मेरी एल्बम में सिर्फ शादी की पुरानी फोटोज। क्यों? सिर्फ हस्बैंड की से मेरी और मेरी बेस्ट फ्रेंड मीरा की शादी सेम ईयर में हुई, 2022 में। मीरा की शादी एक डॉक्टर से हुई, सैलरी 5 लाख रुपए। मेरी शादी एक प्राइवेट कंपनी वाले से, सैलरी 22,000 रुपए। पहले 6 महीने एडजस्ट।
All right, let's just dive right in. We're going to tackle one of the most brilliant, but let's be honest, notoriously difficult thinkers out there, Jacques Lacan. His ideas can feel like a total maze, but I promise you, if you stick with me, what we find at the center is going to completely change the way you think about, well, you. It all kicks off with this single, kind of cryptic sentence. The unconscious is structured like a language. What on earth does that even mean? How can our deepest, most hidden self be built like grammar and syntax? Well, that's the puzzle we're going to solve together. So first things first, who was this guy? Jacques Lacan was a French psychoanalyst working from the early 1900s to 1981. He basically took everything Freud said and ran it through a whole new filter, the study of language. And you can't overstate his impact. His big book from 1966 called Écrits didn't just shake up psychoanalysis, it sent shockwaves through everything from feminist theory to Marxism and film studies. The guy wasn't just remapping the mind, he was giving people a new map for culture itself. Now, to really get his big idea, we have to go way, way back, all the way back to your beginning, before you had any words, before you even had a concept of I or me. Lacan had a name for this first stage, the imaginary order. Just picture it, a world with no edges. As a baby, you don't feel any separation between you, your mom, or the world. It's all just one big, seamless whole. A perfect, fluid, almost glossy reality. Lacan called this feeling reassuring plenitude. No separation, no wanting anything, just being. But you know, that perfect, seamless world, it can't last. There's a moment, a critical event that comes along and shatters that perfect unity. And this is where the thing you call yourself actually starts to get built. He famously called this the mirror phase. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's that startling moment when a child looks in a mirror and for the first time gets it. They recognize that image as me. It's the first glimpse you get of yourself as a separate whole thing. And that one moment of recognition, it changes everything. So you see the progression, right? You start in this blissful state of total unity with everything. Then, bam, the mirror phase shatters that unity, creating a sense of a separate I. And that very act of separation is what throws you, headfirst, into a whole new reality, the world of language, of rules, of law. This new world is what Lacan calls the symbolic order. You can think of it as the social grid, the operating system that we all live in. It's made up of language, laws, social roles, gender, all the structures that tell us who we are in relation to everyone else. It is a world built entirely on difference and separation. So there's this huge trade-off happening. We leave behind the pure unity of the imaginary for the structured separation of the symbolic. We trade a world of direct experience and images for a world of words and symbols. And we move from that feeling of wholeness to a reality that's governed by rules, what Lacan called the law of the father, which is basically his term for all the social prohibitions and structures that shape us. Okay, so we've got the imaginary, that pre-verbal world of unity, and we've got the symbolic, our shared reality of language and rules. But Lacan adds a third piece to the puzzle. And honestly, this is the weird one. He calls it the real. This is the raw, chaotic stuff of existence that our symbolic reality, our language, our neat little concepts just can't capture. It's that primordial experience that you can't put into words. A great way to think about it is like a glitch in the matrix of our symbolic world. It's the part of reality that resists being named or explained. And this really forces you to ask a wild question. Our reality is built with the tool of language. But what about everything that tool can't touch? The real is what lives in those gaps. It's trauma, it's intense joy, it's that raw feeling of being alive that words can only ever point at, but never, ever fully contain. So, how do all these pieces fit together? The imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. Well, they all lead up to Lacan's most radical, most mind-blowing conclusion about what it actually means to have a self. And here's the punchline. For Lacan, that stable, solid, consistent self that you feel you have inside you, he says it doesn't really exist. He completely rejects the idea of a fixed ego. Instead, for him, there's only what he calls the subject. So what is this subject? Well, it's not a thing, it's a process. It's a product of all the systems of meaning, the language, the symbols, the social codes that were dropped into at birth. This means the you at your very core is kind of empty, fluid, and always being recreated in your interactions. Your desires are even alienated because you can only think them and speak them using a language that isn't really yours. It was here long before you were. Which brings us right back to where we started. The unconscious is structured like a language. What he means is that our deepest self, our hidden desires, our dreams, our fears, it's not some chaotic pit. It's all organized by the same symbolic rules that structure our conscious world. It's another network of signs, just operating in the dark. And that leaves us with one last, pretty unsettling thought to chew on. If you are a subject defined by a system of language and rules that existed before you ever did, if even your deepest desires are spoken through a structure that isn't your own, then who are you?
Save time creating content and generate a high-quality clone of your voice with 11 Labs. Change the way you record podcasts, voiceovers, and branded content with the #1 AI-powered voice-generating technology. Stop searching for the perfect voice and stop wasting time re-recording take after take. Try 11 Labs for free and start elevating your content today.
All right, let's just jump right in. We're about to go on a journey, but not to a place you can find on any map. We're going deep into the hidden world of the human mind, and we're going to see how exploring that world completely changed how we understand stories. You know that feeling, right? When a character from a movie or a book just sticks with you, or a single line of dialogue just plays on a loop in your head for years. Why does that happen? What is it that gives these stories so much power? For the longest time, the thinking was pretty straightforward. The answer had to be in the story itself. You know, in the words, the plot, what the author was trying to say. But then one thinker came along with this totally radical idea. He basically said, nope, you're looking in the wrong place. The real secret isn't on the page. It's inside us, in a hidden room in our own minds that we don't even know is there. Now, to really get just how revolutionary this was, we gotta rewind a bit, because for thousands of years, the Western world had a very clear, very neat and tidy picture of how our minds worked. This right here was the bedrock of pretty much everything. The core belief, going all the way back to philosophers like Aristotle, was that we humans are, at our core, rational creatures. We think, we reason, we make a choice, and then we act. Simple, clean, we're the captain of our own ship. And that one simple belief had huge implications. It meant that you could truly know yourself if you just thought hard enough, that your actions were the product of logical choice. It even meant that creating art was a conscious, controlled, rational act. The whole system was built on this foundation of reason and free will. And then along comes Sigmund Freud. And he doesn't just question this foundation, he takes a metaphorical sledgehammer to the whole thing. And this, right here, is the moment where our neat and tidy picture of the mind gets beautifully, wonderfully messy. So here's a crucial point. Freud didn't just invent the idea of the unconscious out of thin air. Other thinkers had hinted at it, but his game-changing contribution was to open it up to actual systematic study. He gave us a language to talk about this huge hidden part of ourselves, this place filled with drives and memories that secretly runs the whole show. And this chart just lays it out perfectly. It's a total night and day difference. On one side, you have classical man, rational, in control, transparent. On the other, you have psychoanalytic man, driven by forces he can't see, not really the master of his own house, and using a language that's slippery and full of hidden meanings. It's a complete paradigm shift. So, if we buy into this new model, that we're not purely rational beings, what does that actually mean for us? Let's dive into the core concepts that came out of this massive shift. This isn't just some abstract philosophical question. The answer changes pretty much everything we thought we knew about ourselves, our choices, and of course, our art. All of a sudden, these huge ideas that were the bedrock of Western thought are on shaky ground. Can you ever truly know yourself? Is free will just an illusion? Can an author even know what their own story is really about? According to this new way of thinking, the answers are way more complicated than we ever imagined. So the big takeaway here is this. We are not unified, transparent beings. It's almost like there's a stranger living inside each of us, our unconscious. It's a part of us, sure, but it's also this otherness that we can't fully control or even understand. And that changes the entire game. Okay, so you might be thinking, this is cool psychology, but what does it have to do with reading books? Well, this is where it all clicks together in a really fascinating way. See, Freud didn't just apply his theories to literature. In many ways, literature helped him form his theories. He looked at ancient myths and classic plays like Oedipus Rex and Hamlet, and he saw the drama of the unconscious played out right there on the stage. For him, these weren't just great stories. They were basically case studies of universal human conflicts, and this is literally where the famous Oedipus complex comes from. And this insight gives birth to a whole new way of reading. A psychoanalytic critic acts like a detective of the mind. They're hunting for hidden symbols. They're analyzing a character's actions, not for their stated reasons, but for their unconscious drives. And, this is a big one, they even ask, what desire in me, the reader, does this story secretly speak to? And you know, there's a really beautiful parallel here. A psychoanalyst listens to a patient's fragmented memories and traumas and helps weave them into a coherent story that provides understanding. A literary critic does something very similar with a text. They create a narrative, a compelling interpretation that makes sense of all the hidden patterns and meanings. In a way, they're both storytellers. Now, Freud may have started this fire, but he was by no means the end of the story. His ideas spread like wildfire, influencing generations of thinkers who took them in totally new and unexpected directions. You can really see the idea evolve over time. It starts with Freud's direct followers like Otto Rank and Ernest Jones, but then thinkers like Melanie Klein begin to push back, challenging some of the core ideas. By the time you get to the late 20th century, critics like Harold Bloom are using these tools to talk about something totally different, like how poets struggle with the writers who came before them. It just shows this isn't a static idea, it's a conversation that's still happening today. The impact is just immense. I mean, thinkers on this list took these ideas everywhere. You have Juliet Mitchell using them for feminist criticism, Herbert Marcuse for a Marxist analysis of culture, and then the incredibly complex work of Jacques Lacan, who reimagined the whole thing. It became a new language, and it seems like almost every field of modern thought learned how to speak it. So, we end with this. If the author isn't fully in control of their own creation, and if every reader brings their own unique unconscious to the story, what does that do to the idea of a single correct meaning? Perhaps the true power of a story isn't in the one answer it provides, but in the infinite hidden conversations it starts inside each and every one of us.
और भाई तूने नई गाड़ी ले ली? हाँ ले तो ली,
बट भाई अपनी सैलरी तो सेम है, तो तेरे पास इतने पैसे आए कहाँ से?
देख सच बताऊं, जब तेरी सैलरी आती तो सब खर्च देता है, लेकिन मैं ऐसा नहीं करता।
मतलब?
देख समझाता हूँ, मैंने ना एक आरडी सेट की थी, रिकरिंग डिपॉजिट। म्यूचुअल फंड की दुनिया में जैसे एसआईपी होता है, वैसे ही फिक्स डिपॉजिट की दुनिया में आरडी होता है। जैसे ही सैलरी आती है ना, कुछ पार्ट ऑटोमेटिकली आरडी में चला जाता है।
और रिटर्न कितना मिलता है इस पे?
एफडी की तरह 7 से 8%। लेकिन बेस्ट पार्ट पता है क्या? यहाँ पर कोई लॉक इन नहीं है। तुम इमरजेंसी के वक्त आरडी रोक भी सकते हो और पैसा निकाल भी सकते हो। चल
भाई सही है ये तो। कहाँ की तूने आरडी?
स्टेबल मनी ऐप पर। यहाँ पर इंडिया के हाईएस्ट आरडी रेट्स अवेलेबल है।
ठीक है।
देख अभी तक स्टेबल मनी ऐप पर 7,000 करोड़ से भी ज्यादा का इन्वेस्टमेंट हो चुका है और जितने के बैंक लिस्टेड है ना, उसके ऊपर 5 लाख तक का पैसा DICGC के थ्रू इंश्योर्ड है, जो आरबीआई की सब्सिडरी है।
अब समझ आया कि गाड़ी आई कहाँ से।
हाँ, तू भी स्टेबल मनी ऐप डाउनलोड कर, नेक्स्ट गाड़ी तेरी हो सकती है।
Hey everyone, and welcome. So let's just jump right in. Have you ever really thought about what a book is? I mean, beyond just the story. What if, when you pick up a novel, you're not just holding a story, but a product? Something shaped by history, by economics, by power? Well, today we're going to look at literature through a completely different lens, using the ideas of a really influential critic, Terry Eagleton. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll touch on the 3 core principles that everything else is built on. Then, we'll get into this wild idea of literature as a product. From there, we'll explore how ideology becomes a kind of battleground for our minds, look at Eagleton's take on other theories, and then, finally, we'll get to the real goal of this whole way of thinking, which is all about emancipation. All right, first things first, we have to lay the groundwork, because to really get what Eagleton's doing with literature, we have to start with the foundational ideas of Marxism that, for him, are totally non-negotiable. And this question right here, this is the one that really frames everything we're about to talk about. Just think about that for a second. We usually think of art as, this pure thing that just flows from some genius's mind. But this whole perspective challenges that. It asks us to see a book as something forged in the real material world, something shaped by the very society that it came from. And our guide for this whole deep dive is Terry Eagleton. He's a really prominent British critic who spent his entire career re-examining literature through a modern Marxist framework, a huge voice in this field. Okay, so this is absolutely crucial. Eagleton's entire theory stands on these 3 pillars. First, the idea that our consciousness, our beliefs, our morals, even our feelings, it doesn't just pop out of nowhere. It's shaped by our real material lives. Second, that the engine of history, the thing that drives it forward, is class struggle. And third, and this is a big one, he insists on a commitment to political revolution. This isn't just about thinking, it's about linking theory directly to action. All right, so we have these big foundational ideas, but how in the world does this connect to a poem or a novel? Let's take a look at how Eagleton builds that bridge. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. When most of us hear means of production, we think of factories, machines, assembly lines. But Eagleton says, hang on, there's another, maybe even more important kind of production going on. The production of us. The production of human subjectivity, our thoughts, our feelings, our very sense of who we are. And boom, this is where literature comes in. See, for Eagleton, literature isn't just some passive mirror reflecting society. No way. It's an active part of this whole machine. Think about a novel by, say, Charles Dickens. It's not just a good story, it's a product of industrial capitalism in Victorian England. The poverty, the class system, all the anxieties of the characters, they are all shaped by the material world of that time. So in this view, the novel itself helps produce a certain way of understanding that world. This leads us right into one of the most critical concepts in this entire analysis, ideology. Because if our minds are being shaped and produced, then the fight over what is doing the shaping is everything. So what even is ideology in this context? Well, you can think of it as the glue between the real material world and our inner mental world. It's that whole system of beliefs and values that makes the current power structure seem, normal, natural, inevitable. Its job is to create ways of seeing the world that, in the end, keep the dominant political order in charge. And this quote from Eagleton just hits so hard. It really drives the point home. The toughest battle isn't out there on a battlefield. It's inside our own heads. The real struggle is to free that space of subjectivity, our inner world, which he argues has basically been colonized by the ruling ideology. Now, Eagleton wasn't just coming up with these ideas in a bubble. He was in conversation and in debate with other big literary theories of his day, and he had some pretty sharp critiques for them. So here's his main beef, laid out pretty clearly. Eagleton looked at other radical theories, like structuralism, and saw a huge problem. They often treated books like these self-contained little puzzles, totally ignoring the world outside the page. For Eagleton, that was a massive failure. By not connecting literature back to the real-world struggles of economics and society, he argued that these theories, no matter how smart they sounded, just became an academic game. And in doing that, they actually unintentionally helped prop up the very system they claimed they were against. So why? Why do all this? What is the ultimate point of looking at literature this way? Well, it all boils down to one single powerful goal. And there it is, stated as plainly as it can be. For Eagleton, literary criticism is not some passive, dusty academic thing. Its primary task is political. It is meant to be a tool, something you use to actively help free people, to take part in what he calls the cultural emancipation of the masses. But that wasn't the end of the story. You know, thinkers keep thinking, and as the world changed, Eagleton's ideas evolved too. In a later book called After Theory, he offered up a really important warning for a new era. He basically said that while the old tools were vital, they just weren't enough to tackle the new challenges we're all facing. He argued that, look, while the big narratives of class, race, and gender are absolutely indispensable, we can't forget them, theory can't just be a broken record. If we're going to get a real handle on our incredibly complex global reality, we need a wider, deeper set of tools to think with. We can't afford to only tell the same stories over and over again. And that leaves us with a really provocative question, doesn't it? If we take Eagleton's challenge seriously, what are the powerful hidden stories shaping our world right now that we haven't even learned to see yet? What are the forces, beyond the ones we always talk about, that are busy producing our subjectivity, right here, right now? It's a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us.
सर, ₹1 आप सीखो ऐप को देके डेली का 3000 कमाना सीख सकते हैं। अगर बिल गेट्स कर सकते हैं, रतन टाटा कर सकते हैं, राकेश झुंझुनवाला कर सकते हैं, तो आप भी कर सकते हो। बस हार नहीं माननी है और रोज सीखो ऐप से सीखते रहना। आप रील देखने में दिन के 4-5 घंटे तो वेस्ट करते ही होंगे। एक दिन में 5 घंटे मतलब एक हफ्ते में 35 घंटे, एक महीने में 6 दिन और एक साल में 2.5 महीने। अब सोचो वो 2.5 महीने अगर आपने सीखो ऐप पे बिताए होते तो अब तक आप पार्ट टाइम इनकम कमाने के 5-6 परमानेंट तरीके तो जरूर सीख गए होते। ये तरीके आप YouTube पर भी ढूंढ सकते हो, लेकिन YouTube पर आपको सही वीडियो ढूंढने में बहुत टाइम लग जाएगा और बीच में कुछ यहाँ वहाँ के वीडियो देखने में भी टाइम वेस्ट हो जाएगा। सीखो ऐप पर ऐसा नहीं है। सीखो भी एक ऐसी ऐप है जहाँ पे वीडियोस आते हैं, लेकिन उसमें काम का वीडियो तुरंत ही मिल जाता है, क्योंकि वहाँ पे सिर्फ ऐसे वीडियोस ही अलाउड हैं जिनसे आप कुछ सीख सको। YouTube का क्या है, वहाँ तो कोई भी कुछ भी वीडियो डाल सकता है। आपको तो वीडियो देखने के बाद ही पता चलेगा ना कि वो काम का था या नहीं। वहीं दूसरी तरफ सीखो ऐप का वीडियो 100% काम का होता है। सीखो की टीम पहले वेरीफाई करती है कि जो आदमी वीडियो बना रहा है वो कोई एक्सपर्ट भी है या नहीं, और फिर अगर वीडियो में जेन्युइन जानकारी होती है तभी वो ऐप पर आता है। इसका मतलब आप सीखो ऐप पर जो पेड वर्क ऐप से डॉलर कमाने का तरीका सीखेंगे वो एकदम सही होगा। और इतना ही नहीं, पार्ट टाइम इनकम के तरीकों के साथ साथ आप बिजनेस, स्टॉक मार्केट और इंग्लिश स्पीकिंग भी सीख सकते हो। इंस्टॉल नाउ पे क्लिक करो और अभी सीखो ऐप डाउनलोड करो।
Bowling at ₹400 and SIP at just ₹100. Open free Demat account.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all the scheme-related documents carefully.
Have you ever wondered if the stories we love, the books, the movies, the shows, are really more than just entertainment? Well, starting back in the 1960s, a massive revolution in thinking proposed exactly that. A new wave of critics began to argue that to really get a story, you can't just look at the plot and the characters. You have to look deeper, into the very DNA of the society that created it. And that right there brings us to the core question. Is a book the singular creation of some lone genius, or is it something else? Is it a product of its time, shaped by all these invisible social and economic forces buzzing around it? That's exactly what we're going to unpack. All right, let's dive in. This whole story really kicks off with a new generation of Marxist critics who felt that the way people analyzed literature was, well, a little too soft, a little too focused on vague feelings and the author's supposed genius. They wanted to build a science of literature. And this slide really nails the fundamental change that was happening. The old way of doing things, this kind of humanistic approach, it was all about the author's unique creativity and what they intended to say. But that was getting thrown out the window. The new structuralist way argued that the author's intention, not nearly as important as the huge systems, social, economic, political, that are really pulling the strings behind the text. Yeah, this was a totally deliberate pivot away from that romantic idea of the artist creating in a vacuum. These thinkers were after a science of culture, a kind of rule book that could explain how all cultural things, not just one book, actually come into being. So, who was leading this charge? This whole intellectual revolution was really spearheaded by an incredibly influential group of French thinkers. They're the ones who took these big, abstract ideas about structures and forged them into powerful new tools for analysis. So let's meet some of the key players. First up is Louis Althusser. He was a central figure here for sure. He completely rejected the whole game of trying to guess what was going on inside an author's head. For Althusser, a text wasn't a window into a soul, it was a product of ideology, an object that you could and should analyze scientifically. Althusser had this killer term for this kind of shift, an epistemological break. It means a complete radical shattering of an old way of thinking. You know, like the shift from thinking the sun orbits the earth to realizing the earth orbits the sun. It's a total paradigm shift. He even argued that Marx himself had one of these breaks, moving from his early, more philosophical stuff to the hardcore scientific analysis in Das Kapital. Now, let's bring in his contemporary, Pierre Maucheret, who built on this. Maucheret gave us this fantastic concept of lacunae. He said you have to look for what a text does say, the awkward silences, the weird gaps, the plot points that just don't add up. For him, that's where the gold is. Those are the moments where the story's underlying ideology starts to crack, and you can see what it's trying to hide. And finally, from this French school, you've got Lucien Goldman and his idea of homology. Just think of it as a structural echo. Goldman would argue that the actual form of a novel, say the structure of a tragedy, might perfectly mirror the worldview of a social class that feels its own world is ending. The structures are parallel. Okay, so while all that's brewing in France, a similar but definitely distinct conversation was happening across the English Channel and over in the States. The Anglo-American thinkers were wrestling with the same big questions, but they were coming at it from a slightly different angle. And here we meet Raymond Williams, an absolute giant in British cultural studies. He developed a theory he called cultural materialism. Now, unlike some of the more rigid French structuralists, Williams was adamant that culture wasn't just some passive mirror reflecting the economy. Oh no. For him, culture was an active, living, breathing force that could totally shape politics and society right back. You can really see his ideas evolving over time on this timeline. He starts out analyzing cultural traditions and works his way over decades to a point in 1977 where he's fully integrated all of his work into a Marxist framework. It was a long revolution in his own thinking, you could say. Williams also gave us this beautiful, almost poetic concept, structures of feeling. It's his way of describing the shared mood or sensibility of a particular time and place. It's that stuff that's kind of in the air, you know? A vibe that people feel and share, often before anyone can even put it into words. Think about the raw energy of early punk rock. It captured this feeling of alienation and rebellion way before it became some official political movement. For Williams, art is where these feelings first start to take shape. So now we've got the super scientific French structuralists on one side and the more historically minded British cultural materialists on the other. So what happens next? Well, an American critic comes along and tries to bring it all together into one massive unified theory. And that critic is Frederick Jameson. His goal was just breathtakingly ambitious. He wanted to synthesize all the best bits from these different schools of thought into one single powerhouse method for understanding culture. And his masterpiece laying this all out is called The Political Unconscious. So how on earth did he do it? You could almost think of it like a recipe with three main ingredients. First, he took the big Hegelian idea that you have to understand everything in its total historical context. Second, he stirred in the structuralist focus on hidden systems and forms. And for the third ingredient, and this is genius, he borrowed the concept of repression from Freud. He argued that texts, just like people, have a political unconscious, a hidden layer of ideological hopes and anxieties that have been pushed down, but secretly shape everything you see on the surface. If there's one time you remember about Jameson, make it this quote. This is his famous rallying cry, always historicize. For him, this is the one unbreakable rule of criticism. Every single cultural thing, every idea, every movie, every feeling has to be understood as a product of its specific moment in history. Absolutely nothing exists in a vacuum. Okay, wow, we have just taken a whirlwind tour through some really complex ideas. But what's the payoff, right? So what? Why does this whole reinvention of how we think about literature actually matter to us today? So what can we do with all this? Well, it basically gives us a brand new toolkit for understanding the world around us. With these ideas, we can start to spot the hidden ideologies in our favorite movies. We can connect the musical style of a song directly to the economic conditions of its time. We can find deep meaning in the silences and contradictions of a novel. Ultimately, these theories teach us that art is never just art. It's always a product of the world from which it came. And that really leaves us with a final question to chew on. The next time you're binge watching a series or listening to a new album or just scrolling through your social media feed, ask yourself this: what are the hidden rules here? What are the unstated assumptions? What are the invisible structures that are shaping what I'm seeing? And maybe even shaping how I'm feeling about it?
$300 பட்ஜெட்ல ஒரு ஒயிட் ஷூ சொல்லுங்க ப்ரோ. சொல்லிட்டா போச்சு. அதுக்கு முன்னாடி நான் இந்த ஷூவை ஆல்ரெடி 1 year 5 months யூஸ் பண்ணிட்டு தான் இருக்கேன். அதுவும் வெறும் $260 நான் வாங்கியிருந்தேன். ஸோ அதே பிராண்ட்ல நம்ம இன்னொரு ஷூ வாங்கிட்டோம். பட் இதோட பிரைஸ் பாத்தீங்கன்னா வெறும் $300 தான் இப்ப சேல் ஆயிட்டு இருக்கு. கண்டிப்பா நம்ம பட்ஜெட்ல இது வந்துடும். என்னோட போட்டோஸ்லாம் நீங்க பாத்தீங்கன்னா அதிகமா எல்லா ட்ரெஸ்க்குமே நான் இந்த ஒயிட் ஷூ தான் போட்டிருப்பேன். பிகாஸ் நம்ம எந்த ட்ரெஸ் வியர் பண்ணாலும் ஒயிட் ஷூ மேட்ச் பண்ணோம்னா பார்க்க செம்ம லுக்கா இருக்கும். அதுவும் இந்த ஷூ பாத்தீங்கன்னா பிளிப்கார்ட்ல 94,000 கஸ்டமர் ரிவ்யூஸ் வாங்கியிருக்கு. ரொம்ப முக்கியமா சைஸ் 10 வரைக்குமே அவைலபிலிட்டி இருக்கு. அண்ட் ஃபைனலா வெறும் $300 பட்ஜெட்ல 4 ஸ்டார் ரேட்டிங்ல ஒரு நல்ல கஸ்டமர் ரிவ்யூஸ்ல 10 days ரிட்டர்ன் பாலிசி இருக்கிற கேஷ் ஆன் டெலிவரி ஆப்ஷனும் கொடுத்திருக்க ஒரு நல்ல ஷூ உங்களுக்கு வேணும்னா நீங்க ஃபாலோ பண்ணிட்டு ஷூன்னு கமெண்ட் பண்ணுங்க. இந்த ஷூவோட லிங்கை நான் உங்களுக்கு டிஎம்ல சென்ட் பண்ணிடுவேன்.
Welcome to The Explainer. You know we love to break down big ideas here. And today, we're diving into the mind of Roland Barthes. Now, this is a thinker who completely changed the game. I mean, he changed how we see everything, from a slick car ad to the greatest novels ever written. All right, let's just jump right in with a massive question. Think about it. When you're reading a book or you're watching a movie, who really decides what it all means? Is it the person who created it, or is it you? Now, this very question was at the heart of what a French thinker named Roland Barthes was all about. And let me tell you, his answer didn't just make waves, it turned the whole world of criticism upside down. So, to really get a grip on why his ideas were so, well, groundbreaking, we kind of have to get to know the man behind them. We need to follow the incredible journey his thinking took over his lifetime. You can really see how his mind worked over time. His career was this fascinating evolution. He kind of started out as this cultural detective, you know? He was deep into structuralism, looking for the hidden rules and systems that make society tick. But then, and this is the cool part, he makes this huge pivot. He moves away from looking for fixed structures and starts to celebrate the absolute free-for-all, the endless play of meaning. And that journey, well, it's the key to understanding everything he said. Okay, so let's dive into one of his first huge ideas. It came from his book Mythologies, and believe me, this is where he really starts to teach us all how to see the world in a completely different light. Now, when Barthes talks about myth, he's not talking about, Zeus and Hercules. Not at all. For him, myth is the super powerful kind of speech that is literally all around us every single day. It's a system that takes an idea from a specific culture, an idea that's tied to a certain time, a place, maybe a social class, and it strips all that away to make it feel totally natural and universal. It's like a magic trick that turns an opinion into what feels like a fact. And here's a perfect example of myth in action. Just look at this slick, glossy ad for a luxury car. You think they're selling you a car? Nah! Barthes would say they're selling you a myth. The myth is that this car is a natural symbol of success, of freedom. It takes an idea that's really important to one social class, the bourgeoisie, and presents it as a universal dream that every single one of us should want. And that is the crucial point right there. This is how myth does its work. It turns history into nature. It just vacuums out all the messy political and cultural bits until an idea that was made by people feels as natural and unchangeable as the sun rising in the east. It just is. So, once you start seeing these hidden myths everywhere, it's a short hop to Barth's most famous and, yeah, probably his most controversial idea. This one was the ultimate plot twist for anyone who studied literature. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. Whoa. Now, obviously, he's not talking about a literal death. What he's doing is announcing this huge radical shift in power. He's taking it away from the creator and handing it right over to the audience. So, think about how we used to look at things. For ages, the author was treated like this author god, right? The one person who held the secret, single true meaning of a story. But Barth comes along and says, hold on a second, that whole idea is actually pretty new. He saw it as a product of capitalism, this obsession with celebrating the individual genius. He's basically telling us to stop digging around for what the author really meant. Because writing isn't just a message in a bottle. It's a performance. It's an act. And the place where all the magic happens, where it all comes together, it's not in the author's mind, it's in yours. This man, he had to totally rethink what a text even is. For him, it's not some straight line of words delivering a single message. No way. It's this wild, multi-dimensional space. He called it a tissue of quotations. Imagine a fabric woven from threads pulled from all over culture. Books, ads, conversations, songs. They all blend and clash in the text. The writer isn't some genius creating something from thin air. They're more like a DJ, mixing and remixing all the cultural stuff that's already out there. Okay, so this leads us right to the next logical step. If the author is dead, then what does that mean for the book you're holding, or the movie you're watching? Well, according to Barth's, it changes everything. This is where he makes a really sharp distinction between what he calls the work and the text. A work is the thing itself, the physical book on your shelf. You can hold it, it's something you kind of just consume. But the text is something totally different. The text is the experience you have with the work. It's a living, breathing field of meaning that's wide open, with no real beginning or end. And here's the best part. It demands that you get involved. It needs your collaboration to even exist. This image really nails it, doesn't it? Think of the work as that perfectly bound book on a pedestal in a museum. It's a finished object. You look at it, you admire it, but you don't touch. The text, on the other hand, is like this glowing, pulsing network of ideas. It's a web that you get to dive into, explore, and even help build. It's a space to play in, not an object to worship. So, okay, a French philosopher from decades ago, why does any of this stuff still matter to us? Right now, in our world of social media and endless content. Well, the truth is, these ideas might be more important today than they ever were. What Barth really leaves us with is this incredible sense of empowerment. He's basically giving us both the permission and the tools to stop being passive consumers and start being active creators of meaning. He's telling you to question all the things our culture presents as natural or just the way things are. He shows us that seeing ourselves as co-creators and refusing to accept one single fixed meaning for anything, well, that can be a really powerful, even a revolutionary act. So I want to leave you with a challenge, a question, inspired by Barth himself. The next time you read something, watch a movie, or just scroll through your feed, stop and ask yourself, who is writing this story? The person who posted it, or you? Because if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's that meaning isn't something you find, it's something you make. And you are the
एफडीज एक सेफ इन्वेस्टमेंट ऑप्शन तो है, लेकिन इन पे इंटरेस्ट कितना कम मिलता है और ना ही एफडी के कोई और बेनिफिट्स है। मिसकंसेप्शन दो और आंसर सिर्फ एक, स्टेबल मनी और सूर्योदय बैंक एफडी बैक्ड क्रेडिट कार्ड। यहाँ पर आपको अपनी एफडी पर 8% तक का इंटरेस्ट मिलता है। यस, यू हर्ड मी राइट, 8% तक का इंटरेस्ट और क्रेडिट कार्ड फ्री जो इंस्टेंटली इश्यू हो जाता है। एफडी तो लॉक्ड है, उस पे इंटरेस्ट मिल रहा है और क्रेडिट कार्ड से आप ट्रांजैक्शन कर सकते हो और अपना क्रेडिट स्कोर बिल्ड कर सकते हो। मतलब एक डिसीजन और मल्टीपल बेनिफिट्स। और इस कार्ड के फीचर्स भी सॉलिड है। 8 एयरपोर्ट लॉन्च विजिट्स ईयरली बिना किसी मिनिमम स्पेंडिंग रिक्वायरमेंट के। यूपीआई इनेबल्ड कार्ड है तो हर पेमेंट पे 0.5% कैशबैक, कोई एनुअल मेंटेनेंस फीस नहीं, लाइफ टाइम फ्री क्रेडिट कार्ड। ऊपर से मिंत्रा, अपोलो, चायोस, एंटोनी एंड गाय जैसी 100+ ब्रांड्स पर एक्सक्लूसिव ऑफर्स। क्रेडिट लिमिट भी तुम खुद डिसाइड कर सकते हो। तुम्हारी एफडी का 90% तुम्हारी क्रेडिट लिमिट बन जाता है, जिसे तुम कभी भी बढ़ाओ घटाओ, फुल फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी। अपनी सेविंग को स्मार्ट बनाओ। स्टेबल मनी ऐप पर सूर्योदय बैंक की एफडी करो, इंटरेस्ट कमाओ, क्रेडिट कार्ड पाओ, विन विन सिचुएशन। डाउनलोड द ऐप नाउ। Hey bro, 1,000 rupees का इंटरेस्ट आया है
इतना तो मेरे स्लाइड सेविंग अकाउंट में हर महीने इंटरेस्ट मिलता है
यार। आई इन्वेस्ट इन एफडी, एसआईपी, नो लोन्स, सेफ साइड पे हूँ मैं, रिस्क नहीं लेना।
सेफ तू अभी भी 2.75% पे खुश है
सेविंग्स में इतना ही मिलता है, राइट?
तेरे अकाउंट में, मेरे अकाउंट में नहीं। आई यूज स्लाइस, मुझे मिलता है 5.5% इंटरेस्ट।
All right, let's dive into something you use literally every second of your life, language itself. We're going to completely take it apart, and I promise by the end of this, you will never, ever look at a simple word the same way again. So, how does this thing, a physical object made of wood or whatever, something you can actually touch, how does it become this? Just a sound or a few letters on a screen? What's the real connection between the world out there and the words in here, inside our heads? Well, the simple common sense answer is pretty obvious, right? We just stick labels on things. The idea that humanity just sort of wandered around a world that was already there and created this giant catalog of names. The word table points to the object table. Easy. Case closed. But what if that's not just a little oversimplified? What if that entire name-giving idea is just completely wrong? What if language doesn't just label our reality, but what if it actually helps create it? And this is exactly where our main guy comes in, the architect of modern linguistics, Ferdinand de Saussure. He was a Swiss thinker, and his ideas, which were actually put together from his students' lecture notes after he died, they just completely turned our understanding of language on its head. See, before Saussure, studying language was mostly like being a historian for words. You'd trace how a word like table came from Latin and changed over hundreds of years. That's what they call a diachronic approach, looking through time. But Saussure came along and said, whoa, hold on. He suggested something totally radical, a synchronic approach. Basically, he said, let's forget history for a second. Let's freeze frame language and look at it as a complete working system right now. Like taking apart an engine to see how all the pieces fit together at this very moment. So to understand this system, this engine, he had to start with its most basic part. And for him, that wasn't the word. It was something he called the linguistic sign. Okay, so we all think it's pretty simple. A word points to a thing in the world. But Saussure's idea, so much cooler. He said a sign isn't a link between a word and an object at all. Instead, it's this unbreakable psychological bond between two other things, something he called a signifier and a signified. And here's the absolute game changer. Saussure said this entire process happens inside our minds. It's not out there in the world. He called the sign a two-sided psychological entity. So get this, it's not about the physical thing. It's all about how we process it mentally. So let's break that down. The first part is the signifier. Now, this is not the actual physical sound of me saying the word table out loud. No, it's the psychological imprint of that sound. It's the sound image that pops into your head. Think of it like the mental file for that sound. Okay, so what's the other side of that coin? That's the signified. And again, this is not a specific physical table, not the one in your kitchen or at a cafe. It's the general abstract concept of tableness. The idea of a flat surface on legs that you put stuff on. It's the shared idea behind every single table. And this sign, well, that's the whole package. It's the fusion of those two mental things. The sound image table and the concept of tableness are just locked together. Saussure had a great analogy for this. He said it's like a sheet of paper. You can't have a front without a back. You just can't separate them. All right, so we've got these signs, right? Made of signifiers and signified, all happening in our heads. But how does the whole system actually work? What are the rules of the game? Well, Saussure lays out two really powerful principles that explain everything. But really, think about it for a second. What's the deep cosmic force that connects the sound table to the concept of a table? Is there some natural universal law that says it has to be that way? Well, here's the big reveal. The answer is there is no deep reason at all. The connection, in Saussure's most famous phrase, is completely arbitrary. Now, arbitrary here doesn't mean it's just a total free-for-all where anyone can make up anything they want. It means the link is unmotivated. There's nothing inherently table-y about the sound table. It could have been glorp or schmeek. The only reason we use table is because, as a society, we've just agreed to it. It's a social contract, a convention we all just follow. And that leads us to the second and honestly kind of mind-blowing rule. If the connection is just an agreement, then where does any word actually get its meaning? Saussure's answer is wild. It gets its meaning from its relationship with all the other words in the system. A word's value comes from what it isn't. Think of it like this. You only understand the word black because you also understand that it's not white, and it's not red, and it's not blue. Its whole identity is defined by these differences. So meaning isn't some little nugget of truth hidden inside a word. It's spread out across the entire web of language. Okay, that's all super interesting, but you might be thinking, so what? Why does this matter outside of a nerdy linguistics class? Well, because this single idea, that language is a structure based on arbitrary and relational rules, it didn't just change linguistics, it changed everything. To really see how this blew up, Sir made one more key distinction. He split up long, that's the entire underlying system, the complete rulebook of language, from parole, which is any specific thing you say or write. The chess analogy is perfect here. Long is the rulebook for chess, how the pieces move, the goal of the game. Parole is the actual specific game you're playing right now. You can only make your moves because you and your opponent both know and accept that shared rulebook. And this approach, this structuralist way of thinking, looking for the underlying system, the long of things, it was absolutely explosive. It was like a virus that infected every field of thought. Anthropologists started looking for the grammar of myths and rituals. Psychoanalysts like Jacques Lacan argued the unconscious was structured like a language. Literary theorists, philosophers, everybody started using this toolkit. Seriously, Saussure didn't just give us a new way to see language. He gave the entire 20th century a new way to think. Which leaves us with one last kind of unsettling question. If we are all born into a pre-existing system of language, this massive structure of arbitrary signs that literally shapes how we can even think about the world, then how much of what you believe is a truly original thought? And how much of it is just you making a move in a game whose rules were written long, long before you ever sat down at the board? Finish. Moving, meaning, settle. Powerful. What gab to eat? Whatever the author wanted to say, is it hiding somewhere in the words on the page? Or, and this is where it gets really interesting, is it part of a huge invisible system that connects pretty much every story ever told? The answer, as you'll see, changes absolutely everything. Okay, so our journey starts in the middle of the 20th century. There was this group of thinkers who were looking at the world around them, and they felt it had become kind of cold and fragmented. They wanted to find a deeper, almost spiritual truth in literature to push back against all that. They became known as the myth critics. Right, so you had people like Richard Chase and Leslie Fieldler, and they were living in this post-war world that felt dominated by cold, hard logic. For them, a good story wasn't just entertainment, no. It was this vital connection to something way older, way more essential. They believed all literature tapped into a core set of universal myths that could bring meaning back to our lives. Now, this whole idea of a deep mythical structure, it got taken to a completely new level by a Canadian theorist named Northrop Frye. He looked at all of literature, I mean all of it, and he didn't just see a random collection of books. He saw a system so organized you could actually map it out, almost like it was a science. And this was a huge deal. Frye was basically saying that all stories, from ancient poems to modern novels, are part of one giant interconnected system with its own predictable rules. But, to map something that enormous, you need a key, right? A fundamental pattern that's behind every single story. And for Frye, that pattern was tied to the most universal cycle we all know. Frye's big answer was what he called the mythoi. He argued that our deepest, most fundamental stories all follow the pattern of the seasons. It creates this timeless, endlessly repeating cycle. It's a really elegant and powerful idea, and it all starts, of course, with rebirth. First up, you've got spring, which is the season of comedy. And we're not just talking about jokes here. This is the narrative of birth, of revival, the victory of the new generation. Think about any romantic comedy where the couple finally gets together against all the odds. Or a superhero origin story, right? A new hero rising. That's the energy of spring. Then we move into summer, the absolute peak of the year. For Fry, this is the mythos of romance. This is your Lord of the Rings or your Star Wars. We're talking epic quests, idealized heroes, a really clear sense of good versus evil. It's the world of high adventure and wish fulfillment. It's the absolute pinnacle of the cycle. But, of course, what goes up must come down. So Autumn brings us the mythos of tragedy. This is the story of the fall, of decline, of a hero's isolation from society. Think of Hamlet or Breaking Bad, where you watch a great figure get brought down by their own fatal flaw. It's that unavoidable slide toward decay and the coming dark. And finally, winter. This brings us the mythos of irony and satire. This is the world you see in shows like Veep or a movie like Don't Look Up. Ideals have totally collapsed. There are no real heroes, and all that's left is to have a cynical laugh at how absurd everything is. It's a world just waiting for rebirth. And that completes Fry's great cycle. It's beautiful, it's predictable, but ultimately it's a closed loop. So what if there was another way to look at all this? See, Fry's system is brilliant, but it's totally sealed off. It's a timeless, unchanging structure, and that means it can't really explain how meaning changes over time. To break out of that static model, literary theory had to look to a completely different field, the study of language itself, led by this Swiss linguist, Ferdinand de Saussure. And this brings us to structuralism. Here is its central, game-changing idea. Nothing has meaning on its own. It just doesn't. Instead, the meaning of any word, or any character, or any image comes entirely from its relationship to all the other pieces in the system. It's like this giant web of differences. Saussure's big insight was that the link between a word, a sign, and the thing it points to is completely arbitrary. It's just a convention we all agree on. I mean, the word tree has no natural, essential tree-ness to it. It only has meaning because we all agree it's not the word bush or rock. Meaning is literally created by difference. Okay, so this insight, it changes everything about how you analyze a story. The old school way was to look at history, to ask, what was the author trying to say? But the structuralist approach is different. It basically freezes a text in a single moment in time, and it asks a brand new question. How does this whole system of signs work right now? How do all these parts relate to each other to create the meaning we're getting? And this leads to the most radical and maybe the most famous idea to come out of structuralist thought. It's sometimes called anti-humanist because it knocks the individual human off the pedestal and focuses instead on the bigger, impersonal systems we're all a part of. And that includes a radical new way of thinking about the author. You know, we have this really powerful, romantic idea of the author as this solitary genius, the single source of a story's meaning. Well, structuralism just completely flips that on its head. It suggests the author isn't some kind of creator god. They're more like a really skilled DJ, mixing and arranging words and story structures that the culture has already given them. So the individual author almost dissolves. And what becomes truly important is the impersonal system of language itself. I mean, the author doesn't invent the language, right? It's the language and all its built-in structures that allow the author to write in the first place. The system is always bigger than the individual. So, what's the big takeaway here? Let's zoom out. We've journeyed from seeing stories as these timeless, universal myths to looking at them as really complex systems that we can actually analyze, almost like a science. And we saw the source of meaning get pulled away from the author's mind and placed into the vast shared structure of language itself. And that leaves us with one last big provocative thought. If the very language we use and the stories we tell are shaped by these deep, impersonal structures that we all swim in, what does that say about our own individual creativity? Are any of us truly original? Or are we all just becoming masterful arrangers of the pieces that the system...
ऑफिस में मीटिंग हुई, मैनेजर ने बोला कंपनी में रीस्ट्रक्चरिंग होगी, कुछ लोगों को जाना पड़ेगा। उस दिन से मेरी रात की नींद उड़ गई, क्योंकि अगर मेरी नौकरी गई तो अगली सैलरी कहां से आएगी? पहले मैं भी नौकरी करता था, 23,000 की सैलरी 1 तारीख को आती थी, 15 तारीख तक खत्म। रेंट 8,000, EMI 5,000, घर बेचता था 4,000, बाकी खाना पीना कुछ नहीं बचता था।
All right, today we are jumping headfirst into the world of one of the most radical and, intentionally shocking thinkers of the 20th century, the French philosopher Georges Bataille. So, get ready, because this is not your typical philosophy class. I mean, let's just start with this quote right here. When the leader of the Surrealist movement, a group that was all about pushing boundaries, calls you an excremental philosopher, you know you're dealing with someone on a whole other level. That really tells you something about the impression Bataille made. It's a heck of a title, isn't it? The Metaphysician of Evil. It just begs the question, what kind of philosophy is built on embracing the very things we're taught to fear and hide away? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into. Okay, so to get our heads around his pretty wild ideas, we're going to move through 5 parts. We'll start with who he was, dive into his core concepts like heterology and the accursed share, look at the big battle in his philosophy, and then see why he still matters today. So let's start with the man himself, Georges Bataille. Because to really understand his ideas, you kind of have to understand the guy who was standing right in the middle of some of the craziest intellectual movements of his time. What's wild is just how much ground he covered. This guy wasn't just some dusty philosopher. No, he was writing about economics, about art, even about pornography. He hung out with the surrealists for a bit before they had a huge falling out. And he didn't just want to debate you. He talked about intellectual violence. His whole goal was to write things that would genuinely get under your skin, to shock you out of your comfortable everyday thinking. Okay, so this brings us to his core project. See, Bataille wasn't just being shocking for the sake of it. He was trying to build a whole new way of looking at the world, a new science he called heterology. And the name itself gives you a huge clue. Heterology comes from the Greek heteros, which just means other or different. So this was his science of the other, a science dedicated to studying everything our neat and tidy society considers waste or taboo, all the stuff we try to push away. He actually gives us a really powerful way to picture this. Imagine that our modern rational society is like a perfectly clean, minimalist room. Everything in it is useful and has a purpose. But to keep it that clean, you have to take all the garbage, the filth, the stuff that doesn't belong, and you violently shove it into a closet and lock the door. Well, Bataille's heterology is all about finding the key to that closet, opening the door, and taking a long, hard look at what's inside. And this leads us to the big question. What is in that closet? Bataille had a name for it, La Part Maudite, which translates to the accursed share. And this is where things get really intense. The accursed share isn't just physical trash. It's everything that's unproductive, excessive, and forbidden. We're talking about things like ritual sacrifice, pure violence, and yeah, even the messy, biological, bodily parts of ourselves that our rational minds try so hard to pretend don't exist. So why do we throw these things out? Well, for Bataille, it's pretty simple. You can't have order unless you define what's disorderly. You can't call something clean without pointing to something else and calling it filth. He argued that our entire idea of a rational society is literally built on top of the violent rejection of this accursed part of who we are. This gets us to the absolute heart of the conflict in Bataille's work. He saw pretty much the entire history of Western civilization as one long, brutal battle between two things: the clean, orderly project of reason and the messy, chaotic reality of the body. You can really see it as a showdown between two teams. On one side, you've got what he called the homogenizing project. This is the world of reason, order, efficiency, capitalism, a system that wants everything to be useful and predictable. But on the other side, you've got the heterogeneous. That's the body, desire, waste, sacrifice, everything that is gloriously unproductive. And Bataille's point is that the first side is always trying to crush the second. Now, he wasn't just making this up out of nowhere. He was inspired by thinkers like the Marquis de Sade, who argued that reason itself isn't some neutral, helpful guide. No, reason is a form of power. It's a weapon that society uses to tame our desires and beat our bodies into submission, all for the sake of order and, especially today, economic productivity. So, let's wrap this all up. Why does this philosopher of the obscene, of all things, still matter? Well, because after he died, his work didn't just fade away. In fact, it kind of exploded. He published his most famous book, The Accursed Share, in 1949, and things were quiet for a while. But then, in the 1960s, his work was rediscovered, and it became totally essential for a whole new generation of thinkers, the post-structuralists. Big names like Derrida, Kristeva, and Baudrillard grabbed his ideas about waste and excess and just ran with them, completely changing the game for philosophy. When you step back, you see that Bataille was part of this bigger tradition, with guys like Nietzsche and Freud, who were also poking holes in the idea that reason is king. But what made Bataille so different, so shocking, was his scatological emphasis, his absolute fearless focus on the base, the filthy, the forbidden. And this leaves us with one final kind of provocative thought. Bataille wanted to unleash these suppressed forces, to kick open that closet door. But look around us today. Has the accursed share really been set free? Or has our world just found a way to take all our desires for violence, for excess, for the taboo, put them in a shiny package, and sell them right back to us? It's a question you have to think Bataille himself would have found.
Hello, where are you right now? I'm at my home. Priya, tell me about your family. I'm having one brother and one sister. I'm having नहीं, I have. One brother and one sister होता है. Having तब लगाते हैं जब कुछ अभी हो रहा हो. जैसे I'm having tea. Brother tea नहीं है जो अभी हो रहा है. हाँ, okay. I have one brother and one sister. Good, अब बताओ कल क्या किया तुमने? Yesterday I didn't went to college. Didn't went नहीं होता, didn't go होता है. जब didn't लगा दिया तो बाद में simple form आएगा. Go, eat, sleep. Didn't went मतलब तुमने past tense 2 बार लगा दिया. अरे यार ये तो बेसिक है और मुझे ये भी नहीं आता. क्लास में सब इंग्लिश में बात करते हैं, मैं चुप रहती हूँ. चुप इसलिए रहती हो क्योंकि डर लगता है गलत बोल दोगी तो कोई हंसेगा, है ना? हाँ, एक बार कैंटीन में फ्रेंड ने पूछा What did you eat? मैंने बोला I eated rice. सब हंसे. तब से मुंह नहीं खोलती. Eated नहीं होता, I ate rice होता है. Eat का past tense ate है. Irregular verb है, पर तुम्हारी गलती नहीं है. स्कूल में रूल्स रटाए थे, समझाए नहीं थे. इसलिए इंग्लिश सीखो ऐप बनाया गया है. एक्सपर्ट के छोटे छोटे वीडियो हैं, हिंदी में समझाते हैं. 2-5 मिनट के लेसन्स, बिल्कुल ऐसे ही जैसे मैं समझा रही हूँ. और मैं हूँ AI कोच, 24 घंटे अवेलेबल. रोज एक्सपर्ट से सीखो. मेरे साथ आके प्रैक्टिस करो. तुमसे 500 बार गलती करवाऊंगी, हर बार सुधारूंगी. कभी नहीं बोलूंगी इतना भी नहीं आता. लेकिन टाइम कहाँ है यार? कॉलेज, ट्यूशन, घर का काम. रोज सिर्फ 15-20 मिनट जितना टाइम एक रील देखने में जाता है.
Have you ever stopped to think that language isn't just a tool? That it's actually more like a battlefield? Well, a brilliant thinker named Mikhail Bakhtin did. He believed that every time we open our mouths, we're stepping into a chaotic, exhilarating war of competing voices. Let's dig into what he meant by that. You've heard phrases like this before, right? The law is the law. It just sounds so final. It's meant to be simple, direct, the absolute last word on the matter. Case closed. But come on, is it ever really that simple? The second you hear a statement like that, a flood of other voices rushes into your head, doesn't it? The voice of someone who thinks that law is totally unjust. The voice of a lawyer trying to find a clever way around it. A historian who knows exactly why that law was made in the first place. All of a sudden, that simple, solid statement is a complete mess of different viewpoints. And that, right there, that tangled mess, that's the world Mikhail Bakhtin saw everywhere. So to really get what Bakhtin was on about, we first have to smash a huge idea that he fought against his entire life. This myth that there's such a thing as a single, perfectly unified language. And you gotta understand, Bakhtin wasn't cooking up these ideas in some quiet, cozy library. No, he was living smack in the middle of the absolute chaos of the Russian Revolution, a horrific civil war, and the rise of Stalin's totalitarian state. He was watching firsthand as his entire country was ripped apart by clashing ideologies. For him, the war of ideas wasn't some abstract theory. It was happening right outside his window. And he realized that same war was happening inside language itself. For centuries, the people in charge, governments, schools, all the official institutions, they've been obsessed with creating one single unitary language, one correct way to speak. The goal was always about control, right? To take the wild, messy, beautiful diversity of how people actually talk and shove it all into a neat little box. It's all about who has the power to say, the law is the law, and make everybody else just nod along. Okay, so this brings us to Bakhtin's first real bombshell. The big idea he used to just completely shatter that myth of one perfect language. And the key is this word, heteroglossia. I know, it's a mouthful, but it just means other languagedness. Bakhtin's genius insight was that any language, like English, isn't really one single thing. It's more like a giant, noisy ecosystem buzzing with all these different social languages bumping into each other. Think about it. The technical jargon of a coder, the slang your kid uses, the carefully crafted speech of a politician. Bakhtin said these aren't just different styles. They're basically different languages, all competing for meaning under one roof. All right, so that sounds interesting, but what does it actually mean in practice? Let's run a little experiment. We'll take one single word and just listen for a second to all the different voices already fighting over it. Okay, here's voice number one. This is the hustle culture voice, the motivational speaker, the business guru. It's all about goals, achievement, climbing that ladder. It's a very loud, very confident voice in our world. But wait, an ancient voice steps into the ring. This is the voice of spirituality. And it doesn't just offer an alternative opinion. No, it looks right at that first voice and directly challenges it, saying, hey, what you call success might actually be the biggest failure imaginable. And just to complicate things, a third voice chimes in, the poet. This voice flips the whole table over. It says success isn't something you achieve, it's a feeling. And ironically, it's a feeling that's sharpest for the people who failed. So, which one is the real meaning of success? Bakhtin's answer is brilliant. There isn't one. The word itself is the battlefield where these voices are always at war. So if language is this big, crowded room full of different voices, what are they all doing? Are they just politely mingling? Oh, absolutely not. Bakhtin says they're locked in a constant, never-ending argument. And this brings us to his second game-changing idea, dialogism. It's a fancy name for a pretty simple concept. All language, every single bit of it, is a dialogue. Everything you say is a response, a rejoinder to something that's already been said. And you're always expecting a response back. You're never just talking into thin air, you're always jumping into a conversation that started long before you were born. And here's what that really means. You can never use a word like it's brand new, fresh out of the package. By the time you get to it, that word is already soaked in the meanings and intentions of everyone who's ever used it before. It's crowded. Bakhtin says your own voice has to literally fight its way through a mob of alien words just to say what it wants to say. This breaks it down perfectly. Okay, step one. A politician talks about national security, loading that phrase with ideas of strength and safety. But that's just the opening move. Step two is the reply, the rejoinder. A human rights group fires back with their own power phrase, individual liberty. Then, in step three, an artist comes in, not to take a side, but to complicate everything by exploring the deep anxiety that fuels both positions. You see, it's a back and forth that just keeps going. So where did Bakhtin see this language war playing out in its purest form? He saw it in literature. For him, it was like a heavyweight title fight between two literary forms, poetry and the novel. For Bakhtin, poetry is often trying to be that unitary language we talked about. It wants to strip words down, to purify them, to create one single, perfect, authoritative voice. It's trying to sculpt a flawless crystal. The novel, though, it does the exact opposite. The novel isn't interested in being pure. It thrives on being messy. It throws open its doors and invites in a whole carnival of different voices and languages. And it does it on purpose, just to watch them argue and clash. And this is exactly why Bakhtin was the novel's biggest champion. He believed it was the only art form that was messy enough and big enough to actually capture what reality is like. I mean, a single novel can have the voice of a farmer, a scientist, a soldier, and a saint, all in one place, letting their totally different worlds collide. It doesn't try to create harmony, it's all about orchestrating the chaos. So what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, it goes way beyond just language and books. Bakhtin's ideas force us to totally rethink one of the biggest concepts there is, truth itself. You see, for Bakhtin, truth isn't some fixed object, like a jewel buried in the ground that one person can just dig up. Truth isn't a destination. He said truth is an event. It's something that is born in the space between people as they talk and argue and search for it together. It's messy, it's ongoing, and it absolutely requires every single one of our voices to even happen. And that kind of leaves us with a pretty huge question, doesn't it? If the world really is just one big, endless conversation, and if truth is what comes out of that conversation, then every word you say, every idea you put out there, it all matters. A lot. It's your turn to speak. You're a rejoinder in this great cosmic argument. So the question Bakhtin leaves us with is this. What is your next reply?
यूपीआई पेमेंट फेल हो गया, इसलिए बर्तन मांजना पड़ रहा है। अकाउंट में बैलेंस नहीं था।
Have you ever thought about whether a story can be more than just, a story? Could it actually be a tool? Maybe even a weapon? A blueprint for changing the entire world? Well, that's what we're diving into today, the story of Marxist literary theory. It's this incredibly powerful and, often controversial, way of seeing how art, money, and politics are all tangled up together. And really, this is the big question, isn't it? At the heart of it all. Marxist theory says absolutely yes. It argues that culture, everything from revolutionary books to the movies we watch today, isn't just a mirror reflecting society. No, it's a battleground. It's where the fight for ideas happens and where power is ultimately won or lost. So here's our roadmap. We're going to trace this whole idea from its raw beginnings with Marx and Engels right through the fire of the Russian Revolution and into these really complex debates that, believe it or not, still shape how we talk about art today. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so first things first, it's super important to understand that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels never actually sat down and wrote one big book called Our Theory of Art. It just didn't happen. What they did leave behind was a trail of clues, these incredibly powerful ideas. You can think of them as core predispositions that became the raw materials for everything that came later. And what's so wild about this framework is how it yanks art right down to earth. The big idea here is that a painting or a novel isn't some magical thing floating in a vacuum. Nope, it's a product, just like anything else. And it's shaped by money, by class, by ideology. The theory even says the very language we use to tell stories is tied to our real material lives. I mean, that was a radical idea, that art isn't outside the system, it's a fundamental part of it. So you've got these foundational ideas out there. The next generation of Marxist thinkers, they took on the job of trying to build a real system out of them. And a major player here was a guy named Georgy Plekhanov, often called the father of Russian Marxism. He came up with a really fascinating way to think about art's job in society. Plekhanov basically said that art has two modes, and which one it's in depends entirely on the political mood. So when artists feel hopeless, alienated, like they can't change anything, their art tends to become art for art's sake. You know, it's beautiful, but it completely pulls back from social problems. But, and this is the key, when artists feel that real change is on the horizon, their art becomes utilitarian. It picks a side, it gets its hands dirty, and actively tries to change the world. And then, 1917. Theory slams right into reality with the Russian Revolution. All of a sudden, these academic debates weren't just for intellectuals anymore. They had life or death consequences. The questions became urgent. What is an artist's role in a brand new country? And just how much control should the government have over art? You can just feel the energy of this period. It was a total whirlwind. You have Lenin's early writings setting the stage, then the revolution itself completely changes the game. Then you see this fierce debate emerge with Trotsky arguing for artistic freedom, and it all leads up to the state finally stepping in and saying, this is the official art now, which was called socialist realism. Now, Lenin's position here is a little tricky, and it gets misunderstood all the time. He was for freedom of speech, generally, but he drew a very sharp line in the sand. He said, if you're going to call your work party literature, then it better be on the party's side. It has to be partisan. Now, he wasn't saying all art had to be that way, but that argument, well, it was later twisted to justify massive state control over all culture. But not everyone was on board with that. Not by a long shot. Leon Trotsky, another huge figure in the revolution, pushed back, and he pushed back hard. He said, look, the party's job isn't to command artists. It's to protect them, to help them. You can't dictate great art into existence. For him, truly revolutionary art had to be free to explore and to experiment. And right there, you see this fundamental clash of ideas right at the very heart of the revolution. So after the revolution, the debate shifts. Everyone kind of agrees that art should be realist, but what does that actually mean? This question kicked off one of the most famous intellectual showdowns in Marxist theory, a battle between two absolute giants, Georgy Lukács and Bertolt Brecht. Okay, so in one corner you have Lukács. He was the classicist. He looked back to the great realist novels of the 19th century and said, that's it. That's what we need. He believed art should give you this complete, unified picture of society, a totality, to show you the big historical forces moving underneath everything. He absolutely despised experimental modernism. He just saw it as chaotic and decadent. And in the other corner, you have Brecht. He was the total opposite. He was all about shaking things up. For him, realism wasn't about a pretty, complete picture. It was about smashing things open to expose society's contradictions and get the audience fired up to do something about it. And Brecht's most famous invention to do this was something called the alienation effect. What he would do is use all these tricks, like having actors talk right to the audience or leaving the stage lights visible to constantly remind people, hey, you're watching a play. The goal was to stop you from just getting lost in the story and emotionally connecting with the characters. He wanted to make you a critical observer, to make you lean forward and ask, wait, why is this happening? Why is society like this? He didn't want you to just feel. He wanted you to think and then to act. Now, while all these fiery debates are happening about state control and what art should look like, there's another thinker, an Italian Marxist named Antonio Gramsci, who's coming at this from a totally different angle. And get this, he's developing his ideas while locked away in one of Mussolini's prison cells. He wasn't focused on force, he was focused on culture. Gramsci's huge, game-changing idea is a concept called hegemony. He argued that the ruling class doesn't just keep power with police and armies. That's the messy way. The smart way they rule is by making their own worldview, their own values, seem like the natural, normal, common sense way of seeing the world. It's a kind of leadership by consent, where everyone else just kind of goes along with it because it's presented as the only way things can be. So for Gramsci, a real revolution wasn't about storming a palace. It had to be a culture war, a war of ideas. He said the working class needed to create its own thinkers, its own writers and artists, what he called organic intellectuals. Their job was to build a new story, a powerful alternative vision for how society could work. The goal was to create a new common sense that could go head to head with the dominant one and eventually replace it. So when you step back and look at the whole journey, you can see how this all grew from just a few core ideas in Marx's work into this incredibly rich, complicated, and often contradictory way of thinking. It's a story filled with passionate arguments about freedom versus control, tradition versus experiment, and that ultimate question of whether you win a revolution with guns or with ideas. Which brings us right back to that first question. Because if we accept this core idea that art and society are always connected, it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought for today. Think about the shows you binge watch, the music that's always on your playlist, the books everyone's talking about. What values are they selling as just common sense? What story are they telling us about our world, about power, and about ourselves? Right here, right now.
एक्सक्यूज मी, क्विक क्वेश्चन। आप अपने शॉर्ट टर्म गोल्स के लिए पैसा कैसे सेव करते हो?
शॉर्ट टर्म गोल्स जैसे?
शॉर्ट टर्म गोल्स जैसे कि वेकेशन हो गया, कोई नया फोन लेना हो गया, या फिर किसी के लिए कोई बड़ा गिफ्ट लेना।
ओ अच्छा, ऐसे ट्रिप्स तो मैं बहुत लेती हूँ, साल में एटलीस्ट 4 बार।
आप उन ट्रिप्स के लिए पैसा कैसे सेव करते हो?
एवरी मंथ मेरी सैलरी अकाउंट में हिट होते ही मैं एक पार्ट आरडी में इन्वेस्ट कर देती हूँ।
आरडी मतलब?
रिकरिंग डिपॉजिट्स। जैसे म्यूचुअल फंड्स की दुनिया में एसआईपी होता है, वैसे ही एफडी की दुनिया में आरडी होता है। एवरी मंथ सैलरी का एक पार्ट उसमें इन्वेस्ट हो जाता है और ट्रैवल के लिए भी सेविंग्स हो जाती है।
और ये आरडी आपने कहाँ से करवाई?
स्टेबल मनी ऐप से। यहाँ 7 से 8% तक की हाई इंटरेस्ट वाली सारी आरडीज मिल जाती है, जहाँ पे आप अमाउंट भी खुद सिलेक्ट कर सकते हो, ड्यूरेशन भी खुद सिलेक्ट कर सकते हो और यूपीआई सेटअप भी कर सकते हो। कभी स्टॉप करनी है तो स्टॉप भी कर सकते हो और पैसे विड्रॉल भी कर सकते हो। तो अब आप भी अपनी नेक्स्ट वेकेशन के लिए आरडी सेटअप करो ओनली ऑन स्टेबल मनी ऐप।
Trade smooth even when your network isn't. No buffering, no breaking, just trading. Open free Demat account with Angel One.
Investments in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.
Have you ever thought about whether a book could be, well, a weapon? Today, we're diving into a really revolutionary period where political ideas completely changed how we look at art and literature. We're going to trace the line straight from Karl Marx's economic theories all the way to the bold modernist movements of the 20th century. So let's get into it. And this question, this is at the absolute heart of everything we're discussing today. For the thinkers we're about to meet, the answer was pretty clear. The world, its economic and social structures, it doesn't just influence art, it fundamentally changes it. That idea was the engine for everything they did. To really get why this all matters so much, we have to go back in time to the 1930s. The world was in the middle of the Great Depression. Capitalism looked like it was falling apart. And for a lot of intellectuals, Marxism offered this really powerful explanation and maybe a way forward. But this wasn't just some dry economic debate. No, it spilled over into culture as people were searching for answers in books, in poems, in plays, just trying to make sense of all the chaos. Okay, so our journey kicks off in the United States. This is where a group of really socially conscious critics started looking back at America's classic books, but they were using a brand new lens, the lens of class struggle. And this movement popped up with incredible speed. I mean, in just 3 years, a whole series of bombshell books just hit the shelves. It really started in 31 when Edmund Wilson pointed out this revolution of the word. Right after him came Calverton and Hicks, publishing major works that used Marxist ideas to completely reevaluate the entire history of American literature. And these are some of the key people who are driving this whole shift. Folks like V.F. Calverton and Granville Hicks, who we just mentioned, they were right at the forefront. They weren't just writing articles. They were trying to build a whole new systematic way of reading literature from the ground up. So here's the core idea. Their whole project was to go back to the classic American authors, people like Whitman and Emerson, and ask totally new questions. How did their work reflect the economy of their time? What did they have to say about class? For these critics, a book's greatness was suddenly tied to its social and political awareness. Now, this was a pretty controversial idea, and opponents argued it risked reducing really complex art to just simple propaganda. Okay, let's hop across the Atlantic now, over to Germany, and meet a group of thinkers with a different, maybe more philosophical approach, the Frankfurt School. They weren't just looking at books, they were critiquing all of modern capitalist culture, the whole shebang. These figures, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, and Benjamin, they would become intellectual giants of the 20th century. Their work was this potent mix of philosophy, sociology, and psychoanalysis, all of it aimed at trying to diagnose the problems of the modern capitalist world. A key concept for them was something called negative dialectics. I know, it sounds super complex, but the basic idea is actually pretty simple. It's that the goal of thinking isn't just to describe the world as it is, but to actively critique it, to find all its contradictions, and use that critique to imagine a different, better world. It's all about challenging or negating the way things are. Now, let's zoom in on one of these guys in particular, Walter Benjamin. He wrote this groundbreaking essay where he argued that new tech like photography and film, they weren't just new tools. No, they were fundamentally changing the very definition of what art is. As he put it, the work of art was being transformed. To explain this, Benjamin came up with this really powerful concept of the aura. So think about seeing the real Mona Lisa in the Louvre. It has this unique presence, right? A history and authenticity. It exists in one specific place at one specific time. That special feeling it has, that's its aura. And here's the contrast in action. On one side, you've got that unique painting with its special, one-of-a-kind presence. And on the other, you have a photograph or a movie poster. It's a copy with no real original. It's designed to be everywhere for everyone. This new kind of art, Benjamin said, has no aura. But here is the crucial twist in Benjamin's whole argument. He believed this wasn't some tragedy. In fact, he thought losing the aura was liberating. It freed art from the quiet, fancy halls of the museum, from being this precious object just for the wealthy. Now, a political photograph or a poster could be copied endlessly and spread everywhere, becoming a really powerful tool for mass political action. For our final stop, we're heading to Great Britain, where the socialist tradition was a little different. It was pretty divided between the people who wanted a full-blown Marxist revolution and those who believed in a slower, more gradual path to change. So this slide really lays out the two main camps. You've got the Fabian Society on one side, led by people like the famous playwright George Bernard Shaw. Their whole goal was to work within the system, to influence policy over time. And on the other side, you had the more traditional Marxists who believed the entire system had to be overthrown. And this created this incredibly diverse spectrum of thinkers. On one end, you had the gradualists and artists like George Bernard Shaw. On the other, you had figures like George Orwell, a dedicated socialist who famously became very critical of authoritarianism. And then, somewhere in the middle, you had poets like Auden and Spender and theorists like Caldwell, all trying to create a new, politically minded kind of art and literary history. So after this whole journey through America, Germany, and Britain, what's the lasting impact? How did all these thinkers who were wrestling with the crises of their own time end up shaping our world today? This number really says it all. The ideas of the Frankfurt School especially had a massive comeback in the 1960s. They became foundational reading for the New Left and for the student protest movement that swept across Europe and the United States, challenging war, capitalism, and conformity. So the crucial point, the one idea that really ties all these different thinkers together is this. Art is never created in a vacuum. It is always, always embedded in the social, economic, and political struggles of its time. For them, there's just no such thing as a neutral work of art. And that brings us right back to our world. Walter Benjamin was wondering about the political power of mass-produced images back then. Well, today, we live in an age of infinite digital copies, of memes, of viral videos, of digital art. So, we'll leave you with this question. Has this explosion of reproduction made art a more powerful political tool than ever before? Or has it all just faded into the noise?
Today, we're diving into the work of Martin Heidegger, who is, without a doubt, one of the most brilliant and also one of the most controversial philosophers of the 20th century. His ideas totally changed the game for how we think about what it means to be human, and they force us to ask a pretty uncomfortable question. You know that feeling, right? Like you're just playing a part, checking off boxes on some list, but the life you're actually living, it doesn't really feel like yours. Well, that exact feeling, that's the jumping off point for Heidegger's entire philosophical journey. Okay, so Heidegger's huge project, which he lays out in his masterpiece, Being in Time, was to get back to a question that sounds super simple but is actually incredibly deep. What does it actually mean to be? He thought that pretty much all of Western philosophy had forgotten to even ask this, and he was going to be the one to drag it back into the spotlight. To even start, he had to invent a new word for us, Dasein. It literally just means being there. Now, this isn't just another word for person. It's about our unique way of existing. You see, a rock is, but it has no idea that it is. It doesn't care. But you are a being there. You're always in a world, you're aware of yourself, and your own existence is this constant project that you're always working on. So this is where it gets really interesting. Heidegger lays out the whole structure of this Dasein. And to understand how we can live an authentic life, we first have to see all the ways we get trapped in our day-to-day. He says it all comes down to 3 core characteristics of our existence. First up, there's thrownness. I mean, just think about it for a second. You didn't choose your parents, or the country you were born in, or even the century you're living in. You were just thrown into it. Like you just appeared in the middle of a movie that was already playing, into a world with a whole set of rules you didn't create. But, and this is a huge but, we are not just victims of all that. And that brings us to number 2, existentiality. This is our freedom. This is our uniquely human power to take all that stuff we were thrown into and do something with it, to project ourselves into the future and actually create our own meaning. And here's the trap. The third characteristic is fallenness. This is how we get lost. We get so sucked into the gossip, the daily grind, the endless distractions of the world, what Heidegger calls being absorbed in the they self, that we totally forget about our own unique potential, our authentic self. As you can see, just gets buried under all this noise. So, if we're fallen, how do we get back up? How do we find our way back to an authentic life? Well, Heidegger says there's a specific feeling, a particular mood, that can literally jolt us awake. It all starts with this deep sense of emptiness. And we're not just talking about having a bad day here. This is a profound, unsettling feeling that just washes over you when you realize you're just going through the motions and it all feels, well, meaningless. He gives this feeling a special name, angst or dread. Now, this is really important. This is not the same as fear. Fear always has an object. You're afraid of a spider or of giving a speech. Dread has no object. It's this free-floating anxiety about being in the world at all. It's that sudden, terrifying moment when all the everyday distractions just melt away and you're left completely alone with the fact of your own existence and the fact that it will end. This dread is what forces you to confront what he calls your being to death. The simple, unavoidable fact that your death is the one thing in life that is absolutely 100% yours. Nobody can do it for you. And that shocking realization is what finally wakes up the call of conscience. It's this quiet inner voice that calls you away from the crowd, away from the they self, and back to your own possibilities. It's a call to finally take responsibility for your own life. But finding this authentic self isn't just some internal psychological battle. Later in his career, Heidegger's thinking took a turn. He became convinced that the place where being truly shows itself isn't just in our heads, but out in the world, through language, and especially through poetry. Okay, now stick with me, because this gets a little weird, but it's really cool. He starts talking about difference, but spelled with a hyphen. He's not just talking about the difference between, a cup and a saucer. He's talking about a fundamental betweenness that has to exist before there can be a world on one side and things that appear in that world on the other. For Heidegger, this difference is the primordial event that makes reality possible in the first place. And this all leads into a pretty wild idea. Heidegger says that we don't speak language. In a much deeper sense, language speaks. It's not just a tool we use to describe stuff that's already there. Language is a event that calls things into being, that forges the connection between world and things. And we're living right in the middle of it. We are thrown into language just like we are thrown into the world. Of course, it is absolutely impossible to talk about Heidegger's powerful ideas on being authentic and taking responsibility without also talking about the deeply disturbing and controversial facts of his own life. So, in 1933, as Hitler was rising to power, Heidegger became the head of his university and officially joined the Nazi Party. In his big inaugural speech, he actually spoke out against academic freedom and basically aligned the university with the Nazi agenda. Now, he did resign from that post less than a year later, but the true meaning and extent of his involvement is still a subject of intense and very painful debate. And that leaves all of us with the big, difficult question that anyone who reads Heidegger has to wrestle with. Do his terrible political actions completely invalidate his philosophical insights? Or is it possible to find value in the ideas despite the profound moral failures of the man who wrote them? There's really no easy answer here, and it forces us to think hard about the connection between our ideas and the lives we choose to live.
All right, today we're jumping into a really huge, kind of mind-bending idea from 20th century philosophy. Seriously, this one completely flips the script on how we think about reality itself. But before we dive in, let me ask you something. Just look around you right now. How can you be so sure that what you're seeing is real? I mean, really, truly certain. It sounds like a simple question, right? But believe me, for centuries, this was the absolute white whale for philosophers. So here's what we're going to do. We'll start with that search for certainty. Then we'll meet the guy with a radical new idea. We'll break down his method, see how it completely shook things up, and wrap up by figuring out what it all means for you and me. Okay, let's get into it. Section 1, the search for certainty. This really is the problem that's puzzled philosophers forever. So here's the fundamental problem. Think about it. Our senses are basically our only windows to the outside world. But what if those windows are kind of smudged or warped? You know, our eyes get tricked by optical illusions all the time. We mishear things. So if the very tools we use to see reality are unreliable, how can we ever be 100% sure about what's really out there? The tough answer is, we can't. And this is where things get interesting. This is where our main character walks onto the stage. He was so frustrated with this whole problem of uncertainty that he basically decided, you know what? I'm not playing this game anymore. I'm going to change the rules completely. And that philosopher was Edmund Husserl. He was a German thinker working around the turn of the 20th century. And he came up with this just brilliant way to sidestep the whole problem. He called his idea phenomenology. And the name is actually the key to the whole thing. It comes from a Greek word, phenomenon, which literally means appearance. And that was his radical idea. Forget trying to figure out the world itself. Let's just focus on how the world appears to our consciousness. And I mean, this shift is everything. You see, the old question, the one nobody could answer, was, what is that tree really? But Husserl changed the question to, what is my experience of seeing the tree? The colors, the shape, the way it makes me feel, all of that stuff happening in my head, that, he said, that is the one thing we can be absolutely certain about.
And this wasn't just some abstract thought experiment. No, Husserl actually created a practical method, like a mental technique for how to do this, how to find that certainty.
So here's the heart of his claim. Look, we can't be sure about the world out there, but we can be totally sure about our own perception of it. Certainty isn't found outside, it's found inside, in the way our own mind builds the world we see. He gave it a fancy name, the phenomenological reduction. But a simpler way to think about it is bracketing. And you can try it right now. First, pick something. Let's say the screen you're looking at. Okay, now step 2. Mentally put brackets around it. Just pretend you don't know if it's a real physical thing. Set that whole question aside. Now, third, just focus on your pure experience of it. The light, the colors, the shapes in your mind. And finally, analyze that. That's it. That experience, that pure data from your own consciousness, that is your rock-solid source of certainty. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds like some abstract little mental game, but no way. This idea, this shift to focus on our own subjective experience, it kicked off an absolute revolution. See, by putting our individual consciousness right at the center of everything, Husserl handed a whole new playbook to other thinkers. He changed the big question from what is real to what is my experience of what's real. And that one little change, well, it changed everything. and his influence just exploded. All of a sudden, you had literary critics. They weren't just reading books anymore. They were trying to dive into the author's consciousness. Then you had these reception theorists who said a book doesn't have one meaning. Its meaning is created fresh inside the mind of every single reader. And maybe most famously, Husserl's work was the direct launchpad for huge existentialist philosophers like Martin Heidegger. Okay, so that's all fascinating history, but why should you care? A century later, what's the big takeaway for us right now? It all comes down to this. The world isn't something that just happens to you. Reality isn't some movie you're just sitting back and watching. No, phenomenology says you are the director of that movie. It's your consciousness that is actively building the world you experience every single second. Your reality, it's your own personal creation. And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. Husserl's little bracketing trick, it isn't just for philosophers in an ivory tower. It's a tool that any of us can use right now to see our own lives a little differently. So I'll leave you with this. What would happen if you actually tried it? If you really, truly, just for a moment, set aside everything you think you know is real, what would you discover about the world that's being built inside your own mind?
Hey everyone, welcome. So today we're going to dig into an idea that's pretty radical when you think about it. It asks a really fundamental question. Have we been reading literature all wrong? I mean, we're talking about a whole new way of looking at things, a lens that didn't just add a few new books to the shelf, but basically forced us to reread every single story we thought we already knew. I mean, have you ever really stopped to think about it? Why are certain books called classics? And who always gets to be the hero, right? Who is the main character and who gets pushed to the sidelines? For centuries, believe it or not, people just didn't really ask those questions. But then this revolutionary new approach came along and started to wonder, hey, wait a minute, what if we've only been getting half the story? Well, that new approach, it's called feminist literary criticism. And really, at its core, it's like putting on a new pair of glasses. Suddenly, you see the entire literary world completely differently. Everything from the characters on the page to the authors who wrote them, it all gets re-examined by asking one simple question. How has gender shaped all of this? And to really get a grip on its impact, we've got to go back and look at where it all started. So first up, a history of resistance. And it's super important to get this right off the bat. This is not some 20th century invention. Nope. The fight for a female voice in literature is a story of resistance that's been written over thousands of years. You know, for most of human history, if you were a woman and you wanted to write, that was a straight up act of defiance. I mean, women were systematically denied education, they couldn't be financially independent, they were up against this massive ideology that basically demanded they stay silent and obedient. But here's the amazing part. They were never really silent. This timeline just shows what a persistent creative force we're talking about. I mean, you go all the way back to ancient Greece with Sappho's poetry. Then you've got Christine de Pizan in the Middle Ages, courageously debating male critics. Fast forward to the 17th century, you have prose like Afroban and Anne Bradstreet. And of course, that leads us to the 18th century with Mary Wollstonecraft arguing for women's education. Then this incredible explosion in the 19th century with giants like Jane Austen, the Brontes, George Eliot, all the way to modernists like Virginia Woolf. The point is, women have always found a way to write, to create, and to resist. Okay, so all of that individual resistance was incredibly powerful, for sure. But the 20th century, that's when things really changed. It marked a huge turning point with the emergence of a formal, systematic movement. You see, the fight for political rights, think about the suffrage movement, for example, it created this incredible new energy, and that energy flowed right into the world of academia. Suddenly, the exact same questions being asked out on the streets about power and voice and equality, they were now being asked inside the classroom. It was this huge shift from just individual authors breaking barriers to scholars actually building a framework to try and dismantle the entire system. And wow, were their goals ambitious. I mean, we're not just talking about adding a few female authors to the syllabus here and there. No way. This was about fundamentally rewriting literary history from the ground up. It was about tracing a completely distinct female literary tradition. It was about analyzing how women were even represented in books written by men. It was basically a call to reevaluate, well, everything. And there were two books in particular that really became the intellectual cornerstones of this whole new movement. You've got Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own from 1929 and Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex from 1949. These two works just laid out the foundational arguments and provided the intellectual firepower that would go on to fuel generations of feminist thought. So, naturally, when you start reevaluating the entire literary canon, it leads you to ask even deeper questions. The movement began to challenge not just what we read, but the very rules of language and thought we used to understand it in the first place. And this brings us to a really deep, kind of mind-bending question at the heart of the critique. For centuries, Western thought was built on this idea that there is a neutral, totally objective way to see the world. But feminist critics came along and started asking, hold on, is that even possible? Or is our language itself, the very tool we think with, totally loaded with hidden values and assumptions we don't even notice? And that right there reveals the core challenge. Think about it. If the language we all use, our tool for thinking, has been shaped for centuries primarily by male experiences and values, how can a woman use that same language to express her own authentic reality? It's kind of like being asked to paint a brand new landscape, but you're only given a palette with half the colors. How could you possibly capture the full picture? This whole critique of language led them to look at the deepest, most fundamental structures of Western thought, and they traced the problem all the way back to thinkers like Aristotle. Okay, a key concept you have to understand here is something called binary oppositions. It's basically a way of thinking that splits the entire world into these rigid either-or pairs. You're either A or you're B. That's it. There is no in between. And what these critics argued is that this way of thinking is actually incredibly forceful and really, really limiting. And you can see how critics saw this playing out all over culture. Man versus woman, master versus slave, black versus white. They argued that in every single one of these pairs, one side is almost always seen as better or more valuable than the other. So this isn't just about words, right? This is a power structure that's baked right into our way of thinking. And so feminist critics just fundamentally rejected these kinds of divisive boxes, arguing instead for nuance, for complexity, and for a vision of unity instead of opposition. So, by rejecting these false divides, it led to what you could call a new honesty. The movement totally shattered the myth of pure, unbiased objectivity. Instead, it championed the idea that every single writer, every critic, brings their own subjective position to the page, a point of view that's been shaped by their unique life, their unique circumstances. And this focus on subjectivity, on our personal circumstances, it leads to what might be the movement's most profound insight of all: the undeniable, powerful connection between our physical bodies and our inner thoughts. Now, this is a seriously radical idea. It completely rejects the notion that thinking is just this abstract, universal thing that happens in a vacuum, like our minds are just floating around. Instead, it argues that our thinking is shaped at the very deepest level by the body we actually live in, where that body is, when it is, and what it is. This quote just captures the idea so powerfully. Whether my body is male or female will initially determine my thought and experience at a far deeper level than which books I read. Just let that sink in. Our lived physical experience, our gender, our race, our situation, shapes how we see the world more deeply than even our education. It's a complete reordering of where we think knowledge actually comes from. And you know what? We've probably all experienced a version of this. Remember being in high school and the teacher tells you, don't use the word I in your essay? What is that rule really asking you to do? It's asking you to erase yourself, your perspective, your history, your body, and pretend to be this disembodied, perfectly objective voice that doesn't actually exist. So when you boil it all down, the lasting legacy of this whole movement is this incredible shift in focus. It validated subjectivity, it championed personal experience, and it placed that undeniable link between our bodies and our stories right at the very heart of how we talk about literature. Which leaves us with one last, really powerful question to think about. This way of reading teaches us that we aren't just reading a story. In a way, our own story is reading the book right along with us. So the real question becomes, how does your body, your history, your unique experience change the story you see on the...
Karl Marx. You've heard the name, right? It conjures up some really strong images, some really strong opinions. But look, whether you think he's a revolutionary hero or a deeply flawed thinker, you just can't deny that his ideas are some of the most influential and, honestly, most misunderstood in all of modern history. So let's try to cut through all that noise and figure out what Marxism is really all about. I mean, just to get a sense of the sheer scale of his impact, think about this. At one point, a full third of the entire planet lived under governments that claimed to be based on his work. And his influence goes way beyond just politics. It shapes sociology, philosophy, and even how we think about culture today. So that's the big question, isn't it? If we forget for a second about all the political movements that came later, what were his core ideas? What was the original argument he was trying to make? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down right now. To really get Marx, you have to start with his deep, profound critique of capitalism. He wasn't just looking at it from the outside. He was trying to get under the hood and understand the structural causes for what he saw as a deeply exploitative system. So Marx saw capitalism's problems happening in a pretty clear order. First up, the concentration of property. Basically, all the important stuff, the factories, the land, you name it, ends up in the hands of a very small group who he called the bourgeoisie. And that, he said, inevitably leads to the exploitation of labor. The working class, the proletariat, has no choice but to sell their labor to survive, creating all this wealth that they never actually get to see. That system then has to keep growing, which fuels imperialistic expansion, this constant search for new markets and resources across the globe. And the end result? He called it the cash nexus, a world where pretty much every human relationship gets boiled down to cold, hard cash. This quote just cuts right to the heart of his entire critique. For Marx, capitalism fundamentally changes what it even means to work. Your labor, your effort, it isn't an extension of you anymore. Instead, it becomes a commodity, something to be bought and sold on the open market, just like a bag of grain or a piece of iron. And he saw that as a profoundly dehumanizing process. And this line perfectly captures his point about that global expansion. See, to survive, capitalism can never, ever stand still. It has to constantly chase new markets, new resources, and new customers all over the world. It basically forces every nation to adopt its methods until, just as he wrote, it creates a world after its own image. Okay, so this whole critique of capitalism wasn't just some standalone observation. It was part of a much bigger, grander theory of history. For Marx, the real engine driving all of human history wasn't great kings or brilliant inventors. It was something way more fundamental, the struggle between economic classes. Now, Marx was super influenced by this other philosopher, Hegel, but he famously took Hegel's whole philosophy and flipped it right on its head. See, Hegel thought history was all about abstract ideas, the evolution of some kind of cosmic spirit. Marx looked at that and said, no. The real driver is the exact opposite. It's the material world. It's about tangible things. Who owns the land? Who owns the tools? And who has to work for who? And this idea became his materialist view of history. The concept is simple, but it's really powerful. Just think of a society as a big building. The economic system, how things get made and who owns all that stuff, that's the foundation, the base. And then everything else, our laws, our politics, our culture, even our religion, that's the superstructure, all built on top of and shaped by that economic foundation. This quote sums up that whole building analogy perfectly. What he's saying is that our material reality, the way we live and work and survive every day, that's what determines how we think and what we believe. It's not our great ideas that create the world, it's the world that creates our ideas. And he argued that this whole process plays out in distinct historical stages, and each one is defined by its main class conflict. So in the ancient world, it was master versus slave. In the feudal era, you had the lord versus the serf. And under capitalism, it became the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. But for Marx, this wasn't just a random series of events. He believed it was all inevitably leading to a final stage. Communism, a society where all those class distinctions would finally and completely disappear. Okay, so if history is this constant struggle, how does the dominant class actually manage to stay in power for so long? Well, this brings us to one of Marx's most powerful and famous concepts, ideology. The answer, for Marx, is right here in this quote. He argued that the class with all the material power, the economic power, also gets to control the society's ideas. They control the schools, the newspapers, the cultural institutions. And that gives them this immense power to shape what everyone thinks is normal, what's right, and what's just common sense. And here's the really clever part. The way ideology works, by taking the specific interests of the ruling class and dressing them up as universal truths that are good for everybody. For instance, the new capitalist class needed free labor and open markets. So what do? They championed the universal ideas of individual freedom and equality. And these ideas were great for overthrowing the old feudal system, paving the way for a new system that just so happened to serve their own economic interests, all while looking like progress for all of humanity. So this all brings us to our final section. We've talked about the critique, the theory of history, and the concept of ideology. But why? Why do these ideas, written over a century and a half ago, still have such a powerful echo today? Well, one thing that's really crucial to remember is that Marx wasn't just some simple hater of capitalism. He actually saw it as a massive revolutionary leap forward from the feudalism that came before it. He praised its incredible technological power, its focus on reason, and its championing of individual freedom. His ultimate point wasn't to tear down those ideals, but to argue that capitalism itself was holding them back, and that only a new system could really deliver on their promise for everyone. And that critical lens he developed, that's his most profound legacy. His whole method of asking who has the power here and how does culture serve that power became a fundamental tool for thinkers everywhere. It helped shape fields like feminist theory, which looks at power structures based on gender, and post-colonial criticism, which analyzes the lasting impact of empire. He gave us a totally new way to look at the world, one that just keeps evolving. So I'll leave you with a final question to think about. When you look at the world around us today, at everything from wealth inequality and globalization to the power of media and ideas, which parts of Marx's analysis, if any, seem more relevant than ever? It's a question that really shows why his work is still so fiercely debated to this very day.
Hey, welcome. So today, we are diving deep into one of the 20th century's most important and honestly most controversial literary critics, F.R. Leavis. Now, he wasn't just interested in how a book was written. Nope. He was totally obsessed with a much, much bigger question. Why does it even matter? But before we get into all that, I want to start with a question for you. When the world feels like it's totally falling apart, what is the actual point of a novel? I mean, is it just an escape? Or is it supposed to be something more? That very question, that's the key to understanding everything about F.R. Leavis. All right, so to really get Leavis's ideas, you first have to understand the world he was living in, because he wasn't just writing from some quiet, comfortable ivory tower. Oh no, he was forging his entire way of thinking in the absolute fires of a world in crisis. I mean, just picture the 1930s for a second. The Great Depression kicks off, fascism is spreading like a shadow across Europe. This isn't just some boring date in a history book. This was the air people were breathing every single day. And right in the middle of all that chaos, in 1932, Leavis starts his journal, Scrutiny. His ideas weren't just abstract theories. They were a direct, passionate response to a world being shaken to its very core. And all of that turmoil, it forced a huge shift in thinking. You know, the old way of looking at literature, just focusing on beautiful prose and clever structure, it suddenly felt, well, kind of hollow. A new urgent question started to bubble up. In the face of all this real-world suffering, shouldn't our stories be doing something more important? But okay, before we get to the big showdown, it's really important to know where Leavis and the most popular school of thought at the time, these guys called the New Critics, actually saw eye to eye. It's funny because we always focus on their disagreements, but Leavis and the New Critics actually shared this one foundational belief. They were united in a single goal, to turn literary criticism from, a casual hobby for gentlemen into something way more serious. Yeah, they both passionately believed that analyzing literature was a serious discipline. It wasn't about just sharing your opinion about a book over dinner. No, it was a rigorous, important field of study that demanded real skill, intense focus, and proper training. It deserved respect. Leavis himself put it perfectly. He said, you can't just treat a novel like a history textbook or a sociology paper and expect to get what it's truly offering. You have to approach it and respect it as a work of art first. And on that point, he and the New Critics were totally on the same page. But that's pretty much where the agreement ended. So they agreed on the how to approach a text with rigor and discipline. But when it came to the why, the whole point of doing it in the first place, well, that's where this massive gap opened up between them. This is the Great Divide. So yeah, they both thought criticism was a serious job, but they had completely opposite ideas about what that job was actually for. What was the ultimate point of all this careful, painstaking analysis? And here's the split. For the New Critics, a book was like a self-contained little universe. Everything you needed was right there in the words on the page. The author's life, the historical context, any moral message, all of that was just noise, a distraction. But for Leavis, no way. That was completely missing the point. He believed the words on the page were a doorway to something infinitely bigger, life itself. And boom, here it is, the absolute core of his whole philosophy, right from the man himself. For Leavis, you simply could not draw a line between a book and the world. To be truly interested in literature meant you were interested in people, in society, in civilization, in the whole messy, complicated business of being human. This whole idea became known as moral criticism. Now, don't get hung up on the word moral. It's not about being preachy or judgmental. For Leavis, it meant that great literature was like a lab for exploring what it means to be human. Reading a great novel was a chance to get an intimate look at our complexities, our potential, and the very conditions of our existence. Okay, so how did Leavis put this big idea into practice? Well, he didn't just talk theory, he named names. He actually created a list, a canon, of the authors he thought best fulfilled this deep moral purpose of literature. In his really famous book, The Great Tradition, he basically put his money where his mouth was. He laid out this clear line of English novelists who, in his view, really got it. They were the ones who engaged most deeply with life. This wasn't just a list of his favorite books, it was a bold and, yeah, pretty controversial demonstration of his entire philosophy in action. And here they are: Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James, and Joseph Conrad. For Leavis, these four weren't just amazing stylists. They were profound moral explorers. Their novels weren't just pretty objects to be admired. They were intense investigations into how we live, the choices we make, and what it all means. For him, these were the writers who showed what literature was truly for. Okay, so let's pull all of this together. Why on earth should a debate from almost 100 years ago matter to any of us when we pick up a book today? What's the big takeaway from all of Leavis's passionate arguments? I think ultimately, Leavis's real legacy is this powerful reminder. A book is so much more than an object. Reading isn't supposed to be passive. It's an active, vibrant engagement with life. It's a conversation, it's a challenge, it's an experience that can genuinely deepen how we see ourselves and the world around us. And that brings us right back to that huge question. Leavis drew his line in the sand, saying you can't separate the art from the humanity. But what do you think? When you finish a book, what really stays with you? Is it the beautiful writing, or is it some profound truth it revealed about life? It's a question worth thinking about the next time you turn the page. Thanks for joining me today.
Today, we are going to tackle a really powerful, kind of radical idea from the world of literary criticism. It's a concept that says we should totally ignore two things we almost always think about when we look at art: what the artist was trying to do and how the art makes us feel. I know, it sounds wild, but it completely changed the game for how people analyze art. And it all boils down to two simple rules. So let's get into it. Okay, think about the last movie you watched, or maybe a book you just finished. How did you figure out what it all meant? Did you run straight to Google to see what the director said they were trying to do? Or was it all about the vibe, how it made you feel personally? This is one of the biggest questions in criticism, and it's exactly the puzzle we're going to try and solve today. All right, so let's hop in our time machine back to the 1940s. A critic named William Wimsatt and a philosopher, Monroe Beardsley, came along and offered a completely new answer. They were part of this school of thought called New Criticism, and they basically said, hey, what if we've been looking in all the wrong places? Maybe the author's intention and our feelings are both red herrings. So their first big idea, their first rule, was presented as a type of logical error they called a fallacy. And this one is all about the author. It poses a pretty bold question. When we're trying to judge a piece of art, should we really care what the artist was thinking when they made it? And this is what they came up with: the intentional fallacy. It's the idea that trying to dig up the author's private intentions, what they were hoping to accomplish, is a huge mistake when you're judging the final product. Wimsatt and Beardsley argued pretty forcefully that the author's secret plan is just not the right measuring stick to use. Now, the logic they used here is actually super slick. They laid out this simple little dilemma. Look, if an artist manages to successfully bake their intention into the work, well, then we don't need to go looking for it anywhere else. The proof is right there, in the words, the brushstrokes, whatever. But if they fail to do that, then the artwork itself is what's flawed. The artist can't just point to a diary entry and say, but I meant for it to be amazing. That doesn't fix the art. The only thing we can actually judge is what's right there in front of us. This famous quote from the poet Archibald MacLeish, which Wimsatt and Beardsley absolutely loved, just nails their whole point. Stop asking what the poem was supposed to mean and just start looking at what it is. It's not some treasure chest where the author's real meaning is locked away. It's a thing that exists all on its own. Here's a really good way to get your head around it. A poem is not a text message, right? When you get a text that says running 5 minutes late, the only point is to understand the sender's intention. The message is successful only if you get that practical information. But a piece of art, they said, is playing a totally different game. Its success doesn't depend on us perfectly mind-reading the creator. Okay, so we've put the author's intentions off to the side. But what about the other side of that coin? What about us, the audience, our gut reactions, the emotions that a piece of art stirs up in us? Well, you guessed it, Wimsatt and Beardsley had a rule for that too. They called this one the affective fallacy. Now, that word affective is just a philosophical way of talking about stuff related to emotions or feelings. So, put simply, the affective fallacy is the mistake of judging a work of art based entirely on the feelings it triggers inside you. And the key point here is really crucial. Saying a movie is good because it made you cry, or a song is bad because you found it boring, well, that's mixing up two totally different things. You're confusing the artwork itself, its actual structure, its language, its form, with its results, which are your own subjective feelings. They're connected, sure, but for real critical analysis, these guys argue you've got to keep them separate. This slide just lays it out so perfectly. You can see how they're two sides of the exact same coin. The intentional fallacy is about looking backward, getting the poem tangled up with its origins inside the author's head. And the affective fallacy is about looking forward, getting it mixed up with the results inside the reader's heart. For Wimsatt and Beardsley, both of these are just distractions from what really matters. And here's the big danger. They warned that if you fall into either of these traps, the poem itself as an object of specifically critical judgment tends to disappear. It just vanishes. We end up talking about the author's life story or our own emotional baggage, but we stop talking about the actual art. So, if we manage to avoid both of these fallacies, if we push aside the author's mind and our own feelings, what in the world is left? Well, what's left is the work of art itself. And this leads us to their grand finale, the core idea of it all, the autonomous text. This right here is the big aha moment of this whole theory. The work of art is an autonomous structure. It stands on its own 2 feet. It's totally self-contained. It exists as this object that we can analyze, completely separate from the person who made it and all the people who will ever experience it. So let's just break down what that really means. First, the text is an aesthetic object. Its purpose is just to be itself. Second, it's independent. We don't need to know about the author's childhood or what was happening in politics at the time. Third, it doesn't have to answer to our ideas about truth or morality. And finally, and this is the big one, it can only be judged on its own terms. How do its words, its structure, and all its little parts fit together to make a unified whole? Now, I know what you might be thinking. Okay, this is a pretty cool philosophical exercise, but what does this have to do with me watching a movie on my couch? Well, it matters because this theory offers a totally new way to actually engage with art. The huge takeaway here is that this whole approach forces us to become better, more careful readers and viewers. It pushes us to stop reaching for the easy answers that are outside the text. Instead, it makes us look closer, to really pay attention to that one weird word choice, or a specific camera angle, or a reoccurring melody. It's all about finding the evidence for your interpretation inside the 4 corners of the artwork itself. So, that leaves us with one final question for you to think about. The next time you sit down with a piece of art, a song, a painting, anything, try it out as an experiment. What happens when you intentionally ignore everything you know about the artist and you set aside your immediate gut feelings? What new things do you notice when the only thing left to look at is the work itself?
You know, have you ever stopped to wonder if there's a right way to read a poem? It's a bigger question than it sounds. Today, we're diving into a really radical idea that completely flipped how we analyze literature on its head. It's called new criticism, and it all started with its pioneer, John Crow Ransom, asking a pretty simple but powerful question. When we read, what should we actually be focusing on? So, let me just ask you this. When you come across a piece of art, say a poem or even a song, what's the first thing your mind goes to? Is it the artist's backstory, maybe the time period it came from? Or is it just that immediate gut feeling you get from it? Well, that exact dilemma is the launch pad for the entire revolution Ransom was about to ignite. All right, so picture this. It's before the 1940s, and John Crow Ransom is looking around at the world of literary criticism, and, well, he sees a bit of a mess. He felt like it was all just too subjective, you know? Too based on personal taste and random historical facts. He had a mission, to turn it into a serious business, something with real discipline, almost like a science. And this quote, it absolutely nails his entire philosophy. Ransom believed that critics were just getting lost in the weeds. They were so busy studying all the things around the work, the author's life, what was happening in history, that they were totally forgetting to look at the actual work itself. He wanted to pull the focus away from the background and put it squarely on the text. So, how in the world do you build a whole new way of looking at literature? Well, Ransom's first move was incredibly bold. He decided to define his new criticism not by what you should do, but by what you mustn't. He argued that to really truly see the poem for what it is, you first have to clear away all the clutter that's distracting you from it. And here they are, Ransom's rules of exclusion, all the things a critic has to intentionally ignore. First up, your personal feelings. Nope, it's not about how the poem makes you feel, it's about what the poem is. Then, summarizing the plot, that's just a shadow of the real thing. And of course, historical context, the author's biography, the era it was written in, all of that is external. Even things like the history of the words or the moral of the story are just pieces of the puzzle. They're not the whole picture. Ransom's whole goal here was to isolate the text, to see it in its purest form. Okay, so we've thrown out our feelings, the basic plot, the author's entire life story, and all of history. You're probably sitting there thinking, geez, what is even left? And that's the magic question. That's exactly where new criticism really begins. Because with all that external noise finally silenced, we can at last focus on the inner world of the poem itself. This really shows that shift in action. See, we stop talking about the work, its history, its moral lessons, and we start digging into what's actually in the work. What's the meter? What kinds of metaphors and figures of speech is it using? How is it put together? What's its form? It's a complete 180-degree turn from looking outside to looking inside. Now, this leads us to a really key concept. I know it sounds a little heavy, but stick with me. Ontological uniqueness. Basically, ontology is just the study of being or existence. And what Ransom argued was that a poem has its own unique being. It isn't just a fancy way of saying something you could have written in a normal sentence. It's a self-contained object, a little world all its own, that exists completely separate from its author and even from you, the reader. And Ransom himself put it in this incredibly powerful, almost dramatic way. For him, a poem isn't just some nice words strung together. It's a desperate ontological or metaphysical maneuver. I mean, wow. In other words, creating a poem is this huge, high-stakes effort to create something that is truly one of a kind, something that you just can't boil down to a simple summary. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway? What's the lasting impact? While the philosophy behind new criticism can get really deep, its influence over the years has been boiled down to one simple, incredibly potent idea, an idea that has shaped how literature has been taught in schools for decades. And here it is. This is the mantra. This is the heart of it all. All those rules about what to ignore, all the talk about ontology, it all comes down to these 4 words. Focus on the text itself. Just pay attention to the words on the page. That right there is the revolutionary and enduring legacy of John Crow Ransom and the New Critics. So we have to end with the question this whole theory forces us to ask. And not just about poetry, but about any kind of art. Does knowing the backstory, the artist's struggles, the historical moment, does that actually enrich the art? Or, as Ransom might argue, does it just distract us from the beautiful, complicated thing that's sitting right there in front of us? It makes you wonder, what do we gain and what might we lose when we only focus on the text itself? Hey there, and welcome. Today, we're talking about something called new criticism. It's this pretty revolutionary idea that completely flipped the script on how we analyze literature. The whole concept? Maybe we should stop obsessing over an author's life and focus only on the words they actually wrote. Let's dive in. So, let me just kick things off with a question for you. When you're reading a book, a great poem, whatever it is, does the author's life actually matter? I mean, does knowing about their personal drama, their politics, or what they intended to write, does any of that change the work itself? This is the exact problem that a group called the New Critics set out to solve. You know, for a long, long time, literary analysis was basically split into 2 camps. On one side, you had people who treated a book like a historical artifact. To get it, you had to know everything around it. The author's biography, the social context, the whole shebang. But then this new way of thinking came along, arguing, no, wait, the text is its own thing. The only thing that should matter are the words right there on the page. So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the core idea behind it all, a technique called close reading. Then we'll trace its roots back to England and see how it grew into a major American movement. We'll also get into what they called the 2 great fallacies, basically the big no-nos of this approach. And finally, we'll look at why any of this still matters today. All right, let's get right into the heart of it. We're going to start with the absolute foundation of new criticism. This is the one technique that really changed everything, and it's called close reading. So, what on earth is close reading? Well, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's a way of analyzing a piece of writing by focusing only on what's right in front of you. The specific words, the sentence structure, the metaphors, irony, all the little nuts and bolts that make the thing tick. Anything outside of that, the author's diary, what was happening in the world at the time, all of that is basically considered irrelevant. My favorite way to think about this is to picture yourself as a detective. The text is your crime scene. You can't bring in rumors or outside chatter about what the author might have been thinking. No, the only thing that matters, the only thing that's admissible in your court is the evidence right there on the page, the words themselves. Okay, so where did this super focused detective style approach even come from? Well, for that, we have to travel back to the 1920s to Cambridge University in England. A few thinkers there were trying to make the study of literature more rigorous, more disciplined. You might even say almost like a science. And there are two names here that are absolutely crucial. First, there's I.A. Richards. He really laid the intellectual groundwork. And then there was his star student, William Empson, who wrote this legendary book called 7 Types of Ambiguity. It was a total game changer, showing just how much complex meaning you could squeeze out of a few lines of poetry if you just looked closely enough. Richard's big contribution was really twofold. First, he made this key distinction. He said science uses referential language. It just points to facts in the real world. But poetry, he said, uses emotive language. Its job is to organize our feelings and attitudes. And second, he developed a method to actually teach this. He would give his students poems with no author, no title, no context, and just ask them, okay, what is this text doing and how is it doing it? Now, these ideas were already sparking a lot of debate in England, but they really, truly took over when they crossed the Atlantic and became a massive academic movement in America. Here in the States, the movement was led by a group of writers and poets known as the Southern Agrarians, including guys like John Crowe Ransom and Alan Tate. For them, this new intensive way of reading was more than just a technique. They saw it as an antidote to what they felt was the cold, dehumanizing industrial culture of the North. Poetry was this special, unique way of knowing the world, and it had to be protected and analyzed on its own terms. And these guys didn't just write about their ideas. They were smart, they built institutions. Through these incredibly influential literary journals like The Fugitive and later the Kenyon Review, they managed to spread their methods all across American universities. And it worked. By the 1940s, new criticism wasn't some fringe theory anymore. It was the mainstream, dominant way that literature was taught. Now, to make their method really stick, the new critics had to draw some pretty clear lines in the sand. They came up with 2 major errors in thinking, what they called fallacies, that every good reader, in their view, absolutely had to avoid. So first up is the intentional fallacy. This basically says it's a huge mistake to interpret a work based on what you think the author was trying to do. It doesn't matter if the author wrote in a letter that they wanted a poem to be about sadness. The only question that matters is, does the poem itself, through its words, its rhythm, its imagery, actually create that feeling of sadness? The author's intention is irrelevant. All right, the second big rule is called the affective fallacy. Now, this one isn't about the author, it's about you, the reader. This fallacy says it's an error to judge a poem based on the emotional reaction it creates in you. So, just because a poem gives you goosebumps or makes you feel nostalgic, that doesn't mean the poem's objective meaning is nostalgia. Your personal feelings are separate from the actual formal qualities of the work. So, if you put these 2 rules together, you can see they're basically building a fortress around the text. The intentional fallacy puts up a wall between the text and the author, telling you, don't worry about what they meant. And the affective fallacy puts up a wall between the text and the reader, saying don't focus on how it makes you feel. All you're left with is the text itself, the work, alone. Okay, I know what some of you might be thinking. This all sounds pretty abstract, maybe a little too academic. But here's the kicker. The legacy of new criticism is all around us. In fact, it has almost certainly shaped the way you yourself were taught how to read. Just think about it for a second. Have you ever, in any English class, been told to support your argument with evidence from the text? Has a teacher ever written in the margins of your paper, prove it, or show me where it says that? Well, if you have, then congratulations, you are a direct heir of the new critics. You've been practicing their central lesson without even realizing it. Now, as the top dog theory in universities, new criticism really had its moment in the 1940s and 50s. By the 60s and 70s, other theories came along that wanted to bring history, politics, and social context back into the picture. But, and this is the important part, its influence as a core skill we teach in the classroom remains incredibly high. That basic practice of close reading is still fundamental. When you boil it all down, what new criticism really did was give generations of students and readers a toolkit. It gave us the tools to look at a work of art with incredible precision and to build an argument based on actual evidence from the page. It truly did transform how we study literature forever. But, and this is a big but, it leaves us with one final lingering question. By building those walls around the text, by treating it like this perfect isolated object, what are we choosing to ignore? What important stories about history, about society, about the person who created the work? What might we be missing? That's something worth thinking about the next time you're asked to find evidence in the text.
Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on your own mind. Seriously, there's this hidden framework that shapes how you think, how you talk, even how you dream. It's this fundamental split in how we all make sense of the world. So let's just dive right in. So think about it for a second. How does your brain jump from one thought to the next? When you're just daydreaming or talking, is it all just random? Or is there some kind of hidden logic, some kind of system running in the background? Well, it turns out our minds are kind of running on this incredible two-lane highway of thought. And here they are, metaphor and metonymy. Now, I know what you're thinking. These sound like terms from your high school English class, right? But they are so much more than that. They are two fundamental forces constantly at work inside your head. On one side, you've got metaphor. That's all about connecting ideas by similarity, how one thing is like another. And on the other side, there's metonymy, which connects things by closeness, by association. And believe it or not, pretty much every single thought you have is guided by one of these two principles. So, who was the brilliant mind who figured all this out? Well, meet Roman Jakobson. This guy was an absolute titan of 20th century linguistics. He's the one who looked at everything from epic poems to just everyday chit-chat and saw this hidden two-sided structure holding it all together. And this guy got around. His journey took him from Moscow back in 1915 to the intellectual hub of Prague, and then eventually all the way to New York. And in every single one of these cities, he didn't just show up to the party, he started the party. He founded these groundbreaking groups that totally changed how we understand language and the human mind. Okay, so let's dig into that first pole, and it's one you're probably already familiar with, metaphor. At its heart, it's really simple. It's all about connecting things because they seem similar, because they resemble each other in some way. For Jakobson, a metaphor is that mental jump we all make when we swap one idea for another because they share some quality. The key thing here is that we're basically saying one thing is something else, just to highlight that connection. Let's look at some examples. Okay, check these out. When we say someone has a heart of stone, we obviously don't mean it's literally a rock. We're connecting heart and stone through the shared quality of being cold and hard. Or when we say a project is a runaway train, we get it instantly, right? It's not actually a train, but the connection is that feeling of being completely unstoppable and maybe a little out of control. It's all about that link of similarity. All right, let's hop over to the other lane on our highway of thought. If metaphor is all about similarity, the second pole, metonymy, is all about closeness or association. The fancy word for it is contiguity. So this is a completely different way of connecting ideas. It's not about what something is like, it's about what it's next to, or what it's closely associated with. Just think of it as a connection based on being close, whether that's, physically in the same space, or part of a sequence, or just really linked together in our minds. And these examples show it perfectly. We say the crown to talk about the monarchy, because the crown is a physical object that's always associated with the king or queen. Or we'll say the White House issued a statement, but we mean the people inside the building, the administration. Even when you ask someone to give you a hand, you're not asking for their literal hand. You're asking for their help, and the hand is the part of them that does the helping. See? In every single case, it's a connection by association, not similarity. And right here, this is where it gets really, really cool. Jakobson's big insight was that these two forces, they're not just hanging out side by side. Nope. They are in a constant tug of war for control, in our minds, in art, in everything. And depending on the person or the culture or even just the situation, one of these poles will usually be pulling just a little bit harder than the other. And you can see this battle play out so clearly in the world of art. Take a look at this. You have movements like Romanticism or Symbolism, which are just drenched in metaphor. They use these grand, sweeping symbols to connect you to deeper, abstract ideas. But then you get a movement like Realism, and it's all about metonymy. It focuses on the gritty, everyday details, showing how one thing is connected to the next in the real world, cause and effect. Okay, so this is a pretty neat theory about language, but why does it really matter? I mean, what's the big deal? Well, this is where Jakobson's idea goes from just being interesting to being, well, kind of profound. He was making a claim that was much, much bigger than just words on a page. He believed that this two-sided structure isn't just a language thing. He saw it as a fundamental blueprint for human thought itself. This constant pull between similarity and association, that's how we process the world around us. It's how we organize our memories, and it's even how our brains build dreams while we sleep. And hey, don't just take my word for it. Jakobson himself said that this dichotomy, this split, is of primal significance for all human behavior. So this isn't just some dusty academic theory. It's like finding the source code, the basic operating system for the human mind. So I'm going to leave you with this question. Just as you go about your day, start paying attention to your own thoughts. When you're trying to solve a problem or tell a story to a friend, which road does your mind naturally go down? Do you tend to build these big webs of similarity, or do you follow these logical chains of association? In that constant battle between metaphor and metonymy, which pole guides your reality? Hey everyone, welcome. Today we're going to talk about a group of thinkers, total revolutionaries really, from the early 20th century. And they had this one huge goal, to completely shake up how we see the world. Okay, so let me ask you something. When was the last time you really looked at your own front door? I mean, actually saw it. You know, the little scratches, the exact shade of paint, the way the light reflects off the doorknob. If you're anything like me, you probably can't remember. We go through our days on total autopilot. Well, that right there, that's the exact problem a guy named Victor Shklovsky was talking about over 100 years ago. He called it habituation. It's this idea that our brains just switch off. We stop seeing things and just recognize them. It becomes automatic, unconscious. He even said it devours everything. Our work, our homes, even our relationships. Life's vibrant colors just kind of fade to gray. So if we're all walking around in this perceptual fog, what's the cure? What's the antidote? Well, for Shklovsky and his friends, the answer was simple. Art. But not art as we usually think of it. They had a whole new job for art to do. And their big idea had a big name. Defamiliarization. Sounds complicated, but it's actually a really cool concept. It just means taking stuff we see every day, you know, the boring familiar things, and making them look weird, making them strange. Why? To shatter that autopilot mode, to jolt us awake and force us to actually see them again, like it's the very first time. Shklovsky had this amazing quote that just nails it. He said, "Art exists to make the stone stony." Just think about that for a second. The point of art isn't just to be pretty or to tell a story. Its job is to make you feel the stoniness of a stone. To break through the numbness so you can feel the world again, not just, acknowledge it. It's about getting that sensation of being alive back. Okay, so how do you actually do this? Well, it's not random, it's a process. Step 1, you take something and make it look unfamiliar. Step 2, you make the shape, the form, kind of difficult, not super easy to figure out. Step 3, all of this makes it take longer, makes it harder for us to process what we're seeing. And here's the kicker. Step 4, that whole process, that struggle to see, that's the art. The work you put into perceiving it is the whole point. Now, this wasn't just one guy in a room. This was a whole movement. They were called the Russian formalists, and they were basically made up of two major groups, both of them just electric with these new ideas, right in the middle of revolutionary Russia. So you had these two hubs of activity. First, in 1915, the Moscow Linguistic Circle popped up with brilliant minds like Roman Jakobson. Then just a year later, you get Opoyaz, which is a mouthful. It stands for the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, and that's where Shklovsky was a key player. These two groups, working together, were literally trying to rewrite the rules of what literature and art were all about. But here's something you absolutely have to understand. You can't separate these ideas from the world they came from. This wasn't happening in some quiet, cozy academic setting. Nope. This was all going down during the Russian Revolution. We're talking about an incredibly turbulent, dangerous time to have a new idea, especially an idea that questioned what art was for. And man, things happened fast. Look at this timeline. The groups get started right on the eve of the 1917 revolution. That same year, Shklovsky drops his bombshell essay. But then, all through the 20s, they're constantly clashing with the new Soviet government. And, well, you can guess what happens next. Once Stalin takes over, formalism is shut down. Done. It gets replaced by an official, state-approved art style. So, what was the big fight about? It really boils down to one question. What is art for? On one side, you have the formalists saying art exists for itself. It has its own rules. The form, the way it's made, that's the whole point. On the other side, you have the new Soviet state saying, no way. Art has a job. Its job is to serve the revolution, to deliver a clear political message. For them, there was no time to make the stone stony. That stone needed to be a brick to help build the new society. So back in Russia, the movement was crushed. But here's the thing about powerful ideas. You can't just kill them. Formalism didn't die out. It kind of went into exile, spreading across borders, influencing thinkers all over the world. And honestly, it completely changed the game for how we study literature and art, right up to this very day. You had guys like Roman Jakobson, who left and took these ideas with them. And they planted seeds that grew into massive movements like structuralism. I mean, some of the biggest names in literary theory for the rest of the 20th century. We're talking Roland Barthes, Gerard Genette, the heavy hitters. They were all building on the foundation that these Russian formalists laid down. The idea absolutely survived. And that brings us full circle, right back to where we started. The whole point of Russian formalism was to use art to wake us up from our everyday slumber. So the question they left for us, and the one I'll leave with you, is this. What in your world has become invisible to you? What object, what place, what person could art help you see again, as if for the very first time? What stone in your life needs to be made stony?
दोनों की शादी में सेम फोटोग्राफर था, सेम एल्बम बनाई, पर आज उसकी एल्बम में गोवा की फोटोज हैं और मेरी एल्बम में सिर्फ शादी की पुरानी.
All right, welcome. Today, we're diving headfirst into a literary revolution, a time when poets stared into the face of a fractured world and realized, you know what, the old rulebook just wasn't going to cut it anymore. We are deconstructing modernist poetry. So this was the central question, right? The one that absolutely haunted the early 20th century. You've got